Order, order. May I welcome everyone, including the Prime Minister, to the 9th session. This time we varied slightly in that we have 4 themes instead of 3, and I'm grateful to you for agreeing to that change. The themes, as usual, have been notified to the Prime Minister, but the individual questions have not. The 4 themes are, first of all, the Prime Minister's leadership style. Secondly, counter-terrorism strategy. Thirdly, migration and population policy. And then fourthly, what I think is going to be a regular ongoing item is an international update. I think we describe it as that because it'll be quite wide-ranging. So those are the 4 subjects, and we'll start with your leadership style as a Prime Minister. And can I remind you of an incident, true incident I told you of a while ago. My first understanding of primus inter pares was when a colleague of mine was appointed Secretary of State for the first time, attended Cabinet, and when it got to a very controversial area of debate, Harold went around the table listening to the voices, and at the end said, "Well, I think that's clearly carried." And my colleague looked up and said, "I'm sorry, Prime Minister, but I've been keeping a tally," and it was 2 against, at which point every other head except hers and the Prime Minister's dropped and stared at their pads. And Harold smiled at her sweetly and said, "I think you'll find my arithmetic is correct." Do you run a democratic cabinet, or are you the one who does the arithmetic?
Well, we haven't actually had votes at the Cabinet, no, which I don't think is probably a very good idea, really. But I mean, of course, you have a discussion on the issues that arise, but you know, in the end, I mean, it would be odd if the Prime Minister didn't have a firm view as to what he thought was the right thing to do.
Alan B.
It seems a good time to ask the Prime Minister, will you change the role of Prime Minister in ways which would outlast you?
No, I think everyone does it in their own way, and my general view of this is that you're accused of one of 2 things. You're either accused of being dictatorial or you're accused of being weak, and you kind of pay your money and you take your choice with that, occasionally both at the same time.
Have you found it easier to get positive headlines out of announcing new laws, cracking down on crime, for example, than out of making sure that departments are actually run properly and administering the laws they've already got?
Look, I haven't found it easy for some time to get positive headlines through any route at all, to be blunt about it. No, I think it depends. I mean, look, in relation to the Home Office, I'm very happy to go into this. I mean, I think there are 2 views, if I'm open about it. One is that actually legislation isn't the answer, and it's a system of management changes. And the other, which is the view that I have, is that legislation is in part the answer, and you need the management processes to go alongside that. But no, I don't. Look, it's not a question of whether it's positive headlines or negative headlines. The fact is, particularly in the Home Office sphere, I think because of the way the world is changing so quickly and the nature of illegal immigration and crime is changing, then I think it's not surprising that you've had a lot of legislation. On its own, it's not the answer, but I wouldn't want to be without any of the bits of legislation we've passed.
But you are without quite a lot of the bits of legislation you've passed. Substantial part of the Domestic Violence Crime and Victims Act 2004, 17 distinct parts of the Criminal Justice Act 2003 are not in force yet. The High Court has commented on the fact that many of the orders necessary to the 2003 Act are not in force yet, and you're reviewing that Act anyway. Far from being content with it, you are concerned, as I think a lot of people are, at the effect of the automatic third off for guilty pleas and the halfway mark for potential parole, which has to be announced by the judge in passing sentence. So all this legislation you're very pleased about, a lot of it's not in force, and some of it you're reviewing within a couple of years of it coming onto the statute book.
Yeah, but Alan, actually, the bulk of it is in force, and the main parts of it, for example, the indeterminate sentences, we are pleased with. Now, there was an issue at the time, if you remember, about whether you got the automatic reduction in the sentence as a result of a guilty plea. And actually the government's view, I think, originally was that you probably shouldn't if the person, as it were, was caught red-handed. You know, there was that whole debate around that. And I think it was because there was a Home Affairs Select Committee report, actually, that said, no, you really should have it as automatic, that we then changed the law. But obviously time goes on and then concerns develop. But if I look back on it, you see, in relation to the 2003 Act, I think it's quite a good example of it. I think the indeterminate sentences are working far better than the previous system. Now, on the other hand, however, as we see from the concern about recent cases, with this area in particular, and I almost think it is kind of sui generis in terms of legislation, there is a constant need to go back and look again and review the legislation that is there, because the changes are happening so quickly in the way that these issues are developing, as I say, not just in our country, but actually throughout the whole of the Western world at the moment. So I think when you look at the Home Office, it's not a question of saying, you know, how do you get the right headline? It is a question, however, of saying there is massive public concern out there about aspects of the criminal justice system. And I think you can track this back, actually going back over the last 20 years. There's been a lot of concern about the way the system works. Interestingly, I looked at the period before we came to office. I think we've had over 50 Home Office bills, but actually in the period before we came to office, there were over 60, including 19 in the last session. So if it is a feature or a characteristic of our government, it's not been limited to our government, but I suspect the actual reason is not to do with the particular government, but is to do with the nexus between the public concern and the very quick changing nature of the problem we're trying to deal with.
What I'm suggesting is that you're afflicted with the same disease as your predecessors, and that is the belief that A, that legislation on a continuing basis solves problems, and B, that it's actually a good way of signalling to people and showing to people that you mean to do something about crime, about a whole series of other things, including terrorism. Haven't you exaggerated the value of legislation and underestimated the problems?
I don't think so, because as I say, there's not, when I look at the major pieces of legislation, and some of them are reasonably small pieces, but in the major pieces of legislation on antisocial behaviour, on proceeds of crime, on anti-terrorism legislation, on asylum and immigration, there's none of those bits of legislation I would want to be without. Each of them has made a difference. I mean, if you take antisocial behaviour legislation, until we started changing the law to give greater powers to the police at the front line, we didn't really have the ability to make a big difference to this issue in local communities. We now do. If you take the Proceeds of Crime Act, if you were to talk to any of the senior police officers engaged in, for example, organised crime, they would all of them say the Proceeds of Crime Act has been an important part of their being able to tackle crime, organised crime effectively. If you look, for example, at the immigration and asylum legislation, now there's still a huge issue out there, incidentally, on both of those questions. On the other hand, I don't think we would ever have got the massive reduction in asylum applications between a few years ago and today, where last year we had the lowest number since 1994, I think, without the legislation. So look, the one thing I'm not saying is that legislation is the whole of the answer, but I, in fact, powerfully disagree with the view, although I know it's very commonly held, that legislation is not part of the answer. I think it is part of the answer, and I think it is not surprising that the previous government and this government have been going back over this area and legislating again.
Have you ever assessed what the impact on a department like the Home Office is of carrying through so many bills, preparing them, having a bill team to carry them through the House, working out implementation, trying to see them through into effect? The management time, the leadership effort which has to go into that legislative process isn't being engaged in getting the department running properly. That's presumably one of the reasons the Home Office isn't fit for purpose.
Well, I don't think that is the problem. I think the problem is that, you see, this is where I have a real, I mean, it's a very good debate to have, incidentally, but I am in a profound disagreement with people who say it is systems management in the Home Office alone that is going to solve this. Look, if you take the issue to do with illegal migration and how you deport people, the fact is the legal context within which immigration officers are working is of massive importance to them in how they're able to carry out their task. If the legislation is not helping them and backing them up, it's far more difficult for them then to remove people.
But it wasn't lack of legislation that stopped them even considering over 1,000 cases of prisoners leaving prison.
I totally agree. If you take the foreign prisoners case, that is a different issue, certainly in most cases, because it wasn't the legal inhibition there. However, foreign prisoners on any basis is actually, it's not the whole of the problem. And if you look at across the piece in asylum and immigration, for example, before we introduced the non-suspensive appeals in the asylum legislation, it was very hard for us. We were having a struggle even to return people to countries that are now part of the European Union on the basis of asylum claims. And so what I'm saying to you, Alan, is not that legislation is the whole of the answer, but I really do disagree with people who say that it isn't a significant part of it. And that's why I think it's important that we go back over legislation again and look at it. And I think whatever government is in power at the moment, this debate about the laws will be important. And there's another reason it's important, because it also does send a signal, and signals matter in this area. And, you know, for example, on antisocial behaviour legislation, it has mattered that those signals of the strength of feeling and intent are there.
Signal's no use if the administration doesn't back it up.
Of course, that's absolutely right, but that's why I say you need both. You don't need one.
Mr. Willis had a point on this.
You must admit, just in these four walls, without anybody listening, that you make exaggerated claims for legislation which are never borne out in reality. If you take the 2001 Queen's Speech, you said you were going to transform secondary education. You introduced a bill, the 2002 Education Bill, to create earned autonomy for schools. There's going to be powers to innovate. And at the end of the first year, 3 schools had applied to change the length of the school day. That was the total commitment. And 4 years later, you're actually introducing a new piece of legislation with exactly the same claims. Isn't it that sort of, you know, keeping your ministers busy that sort of worries us, rather than actually moving forward in terms of a clear agenda?
No, because I mean, again, I don't agree that we haven't introduced greater autonomy for schools. We have in
but that
relation
bill
to.
did, Prime Minister.
Well, you say that, but if you take the legislation we've just been discussing, right, in my view, that will make a significant difference to the way secondary education is run in this country.
The bill failed in 2002. That's the point.
I mean, I don't accept that it failed, obviously, because I think that the whole specialist school system is precisely. Which we're now building on with trust schools and city academies, is a move to where schools specialise more, they have greater power over their own assets and the way that they run their school. And, you know, I am not sitting here saying legislation is the answer to everything. All I'm saying is that legislation plays an important part. And I think in relation to the Home Office, education I think is somewhat different. But in relation to the Home Office, I think it plays a very, very important part in enabling those at the front line to do their job properly.
I'm quite disappointed, you know, because I thought you'd started trying to change the balance. I was hoping so. You wrote letters to all these new ministers you appointed, and you published them, telling them exactly what they were to do. And there was more emphasis in these letters on actually running their departments. And this was a novelty. I don't think Clement Attlee ever found it necessary to send out letters to all his ministers telling them what they were going to do and publish them. But you did. It was not at the beginnings of a recognition that it's no use passing legislation unless you actually run the country efficiently.
Well, of course, look, in any department, you've got to deliver the things that you're supposed to deliver, and departments sometimes do it well, sometimes do it badly. But I don't accept legislation has not got a role to play. I mean, I think it's a kind of somewhat false argument, because we're suggesting you either go down this route or you're going down that route. Now, I think, as I said to you a moment or two ago, most of this discussion takes place around the context of the Home Office. I think most of it does. And all I'm saying to you is, when I go through those 50-odd bits of legislation, I can't think of one of those that I, as it were, say now, well, I wish we hadn't bothered with that, it was no use. Because I think in all these areas, they have been important in enabling those people at the front line, the law enforcement people, to do their job better. Is that a substitute for also having the right delivery mechanism in department? Of course not. And one of the things that is changing the whole time in the civil service is a far greater focus on project management. And again, if you take the immigration department, for the first time, that department is now removing more people than the unfounded asylum claims coming in. Now, that has been done by project management, by delivery systems being put in place by the department.
After 9 years. It took 9 years to get round to putting the emphasis where it needed to be placed. But I'm going to ask Mr. Doran to come in.
But
Sorry, go on.
Okay, back to criminal justice policy. It's quite clear that that policy is driven by you, and that was underlined by the speech you made in Bristol a couple of weeks ago. That's a thoughtful speech and almost philosophical, I would say, but there's also a lot of exasperation in there. Are you frustrated at the response of particularly the legal profession and the judges to your policies?
I think there is a culture in politics and in the legal profession that is totally understandable but fails to take account of the way the world's changed. And I think you can see this very clearly in the circumstances where we discuss cases, for example, of the deportation of people we think are a threat to the well-being of this country. We take the view that basically the risk should remain with us in this country rather than with them if they come from outside our country and cause trouble. Now, I think that is a system that needs rebalancing, and I think you can go across the criminal justice system at the moment, and I've said this over many, many years, which is one of the reasons for the legislation we've introduced, and at critical points of the system, it doesn't come down on the side of the victim in the way that, in my view, it should do. And that's why I think and I also think, incidentally, which is why it's interesting to go back over the period of time before we came to government, I think this is an argument that has been building in post-war society for about the last 20 or 30 years. Because community and social life has fragmented, crime has risen, you've got mass migration across frontiers, you've got organised crime that is of a different nature from anything 30, 40 years ago, and the systems are struggling to keep up with it. The systems were born out of a period where there was rank injustice inside the criminal justice system, where people who were poor and oppressed were often the victims of the criminal justice system as defendants or the accused. And I think the world has just changed, and I think we've got to change with it. And that's why I sometimes say this is not an issue of liberty simply, it's also an issue of modernity. It's about the nature of the change, and I still think that our political and our legal culture is behind the times in this. That's what I think.
That sounds like your Bristol speech again.
Well, it's what I believe. I mean, and you know, I think it is an important debate to have in the country. And I also think it's important that we as lawmakers don't use one language when we're out talking to the media and another language when we're actually legislating in here.
But what you're talking about in your speech
too,
and you're talking about now is cultural change. And there was an important passage in your speech, which I think is important, where you said, "I've come to the conclusion that part of the problem in this whole area has been the absence of a proper considered intellectual and political debate about the nature of liberty in the modern world. In other words, crime, immigration, etc." If that is your view, why didn't we have that debate 9 years ago? And it would have been possible, perhaps, then, to get much more acceptance for the change that you want, and we would have been able to legislate in a much more coherent, coordinated and strategic way.
Well, it's not for the one to try. I mean, the views I expressed in the speech in Bristol aren't kind of, it's not been a sort of cathartic process whereby I've suddenly come to a different view from the view I held previously. I've always held this view. But if you look back on the legislation that we introduced, Frank, over the past 9 years, at each stage that legislation has effectively been diluted and watered down. I mean, that's happened. I mean, now, it's happened for perfectly understandable reasons, because people have said, well, this is a step too far. I mean, you take, for example, the issue to do, which is a very controversial issue, but the issue to do with trial by jury in respect of serious fraud cases. There have been report after report done showing that as a result of those trials taking place by jury, it becomes the cases take months and months and months, they cost millions of pounds, and it's very hard for people to get prosecutions.
But that's not what the report on the most recent case said. In fact, the most recent case, to be aware of, the Jubilee Line case, the report said that conclusion couldn't be drawn from what had happened.
No, what the Jubilee Line case said was that because of the very narrow way we'd had to put the potential piece of legislation, we not put it before the House because of the controversy there's been, particularly in the House of Lords about it, because of the very narrow way we had to draw the rules, then that Jubilee Line case probably wouldn't have qualified for trial without a jury. But the point that I'm making is this: these are very, very difficult questions, But if we don't understand that we have to answer those questions in a very clear way, then we're not, in my view, going to make a difference to this law and order problem. And you can see this, for example, on the Proceeds of Crime Act. The Proceeds of Crime Act allow the police to seize cash that is on somebody who they suspect may, for example, be a drug dealer, but they're able to take the money. It was £10,000 of cash you had to have. We've now reduced it, I think it was announced yesterday, to £1,000. Right? They're able to take that money from the person. The person then has to go to court to prove they came by that money lawfully. Now, there's no doubt at all that is a reversal of the normal burden of proof. And therefore, at one level, it is something contrary to the normal principles of the law and the judicial system. My view is, unless you're prepared to give those types of powers, you're not going to make a difference in the hard reality of life in the street on the community. Now, what I'm saying is, we need to have the debate about the balance of liberty in a modern society. And some people may say, well, look, that's a step too far. And that's why we've had a lot of these cases challenged in the courts. But my view is that unless you're prepared to take those methods, and I would actually take them further, then we're not going to make a difference to law and order on the ground. The only way we've got any action on antisocial behaviour is after the legislation was passed. I mean, before then, there was nothing for these communities to do. No ASBOs, no dispersal orders, no ability to shut down crack houses, nothing. Now, each of these orders, in a sense, changed the normal legal processes. I would like to go further in those things. But, we've got to have a debate about whether it's right or wrong to do that. And I think the debate needs to happen actually away from the headlines of the individual case, which is why in the speech I did in Bristol, I actually didn't get into the controversial cases that have happened recently. I didn't want to do that. I wanted to have a debate about the philosophy that underlies our criminal justice system.
I think Mr. Dismore wants to question where you really do want to go.
Yeah, looking at the Human Rights Act, what exactly do you see the problems with the Human Rights Act as being? Are they substantive, or are they just how the courts have been interpreting it?
Well, the important thing about the Human Rights Act is to recognise that it is merely the incorporation into British law of the European Convention on Human Rights. And actually, Parliament has the right expressly to override. It has to do it expressly, but to override the Human Rights Act. So actually, your issues are with the European Convention on Human Rights. And the truth is, it is possible within the Convention for the courts to take a different view of the balance between, say, liberty and security. But for various reasons, they've chosen not to. And the most outstanding case was this Chalal judgment in 1996, before we came to power, where the court said the right of the accused or the convicted to be protected from potential abuse when they return to their own country is paramount and supersedes any right that the collective in society has to be protected against their activities. Now, it would have been possible, frankly, for the court to have taken a different view. They didn't. So I actually think sometimes the issue is not so much human rights legislation, it's where you strike the balance between human rights of the individual, person who's accused or convicted, and the human rights of wider society.
If we take the Chahal case and the government's attempt to overturn it, intervening in the case presently before the court, it's not just a question of the Human Rights Act, of course, it's our other international obligations under the UN Convention Against Torture.
Correct.
And our own domestic legislation as well. There is an absolute prohibition on torture. Would you be prepared to send somebody back, knowing there was a real risk that they would be tortured if they were returned to their country?
No, but I think you can deal with this, you see. This is where, as I say, the balance of the risk is really important. My point would be this. We should be able to get an assurance from the particular government that they will not abuse or torture the individual. Up to now, what the courts have been saying, both at a European and a national level, is, well, unless you can guarantee this, possibly by having an NGO actually going and investigating their judicial system, we're not accepting that. In my view, the risk in the end, our obligation is to try and get that assurance from the government, but our obligation does not extend to saying in all sets of circumstances we have got an absolute obligation to protect you when you're causing trouble or committing criminal offences in our country. You see what I mean? And I don't think that is I think for most members of the public, they would say, look, if you come to our country, you should behave properly. if you misbehave or commit a criminal act, then the risk if something's going to happen to you falls with you. I think that's not an unreasonable position. Now, yes, we should go as far as we can go to get assurances from other governments, but it is absurd that I think that I can't return someone to a country that they may have a problem in respect of, when this particular individual I've got to keep in our country is inciting terrorism or even committing acts of terrorism. I mean, I think that's where I say I think we got the system completely out of kilter with common sense. Now, I'm prepared to go to that government and get an assurance in respect of this individual, but the idea that if I can't prove absolutely that they're not going to come to any harm, then we've got to keep them here. I mean, why? I mean, surely the rights of the society, wider society as a whole, to be protected from the activities of that person is of greater force than the risk that I'm afraid they've taken upon themselves by breaking the rules of our society.
It isn't one of the real problems with the Human Rights Act. The criticisms that have been advanced recently, based on cases like the Afghan hijackers or the Anthony Rice case, not really problems with the Human Rights Act itself or anything to do with it, but actually, really, they're examples of operational failures or bad decision making. And what's happened is the Human Rights Act has become a convenient scapegoat for the shortcomings of the decisions in those particular cases.
Well, I think that there is something in that, in the sense that, particularly with the Human Rights Act, as I keep saying, in the end, Parliament can expressly override it. So it's the Human Rights Act per se, you can always get round if you really want to as Parliament by saying, well, we're legislating despite it. The real issue is to do, I agree, with the European Convention on Human Rights. My point is the reason we've joined this case, which is before the European Court of Human Rights at the moment, it's a case brought by Holland, which is exactly the same problem that we have, but actually all European countries are beginning to have the same problem. Because, all of us are subject to the same global threats of terrorism, the same mass migration, the same problems of organised crime. And if it's being said, here is this range of countries, and you can't return people to them, no matter what they're doing in your country, I mean, you end up in a situation where, obviously, it's not merely the individual case that's a problem, you're sending a signal in a market that is highly organised, that if you can claim to come from one of these countries and get here, you can't be removed.
But I mean, if we take the Afghan hijacker case, which is one of the ones that has been criticised, there it was expressly accepted by the government before the immigration adjudicators that the hijackers were not a threat to our national security. And the reason they weren't returned was a finding of fact that they would be targeted by the Taliban and probably assassinated if they were returned. And the government decided not in the end to use its legal powers, for example, to go for judicial review and challenge that decision. So the reason the Afghan hijackers are here are not to do with the Human Rights Act, it's to do with the failure of the government to challenge that decision.
Well, but
the
problem is this. The problem, the Afghan case, look, I agree with you in this sense, Andrew. The Afghan case was a very specific case, but the problem we had there is, if someone comes and hijacks a plane in order to get asylum in this country, it seems to me quite important that you send out a signal that you're not going to gain anything by hijacking an aircraft. And therefore, the worry was not necessarily that these people wanted to come here and specifically commit acts of terrorism here, but unless you were able to send a signal to the outside world, hijack a plane, come here, you'll go back to where you come from no matter what your problem is in that country, because we can't allow any sense that people can gain by a hijack. I mean, that was the problem that we faced there. It was a very particular case, but it is very frustrating for us that people who hijacked an aircraft, we've now got to let them stay in this country.
Isn't the real issue around the Human Rights Act the failure of the government to explain the benefits of the Act in terms of court cases where the little person's beaten the government, for example, where there'll be a lot of sympathy for the case, or generally how it can be seen to influence and improve public services? If you take some examples like the Zahid Mubarak case, the forcing of the inquiry there, which has led to some really important recommendations, or the Beryl Driscoll case, where she took on social services and was allowed to remain with her husband in the same care home after 6 years of marriage when they were going to be separated, or the Diane Blood case, the celebrated fertility issues. Those are all very positive uses of the Human Rights Act, but all we ever hear from the government at the moment seems to be criticisms and attacks on the Human Rights Act, rather than actually defending the very positive things that it's achieved.
Well, we do need to talk about the positive things, but I mean, I don't think it's completely the fault of the government that these cases gain a high profile. I think the way it is, these cases do. But the basic point, which is the reason I made the Bristol speech, and why I'm very happy to discuss it here, but I think we really need to have a proper debate about it, is irrespective of the Human Rights Act, irrespective of individual cases that catch the headlines from time to time, there is a very, very deep-rooted philosophical debate about the balance between liberty and security that I think we need to have as policy makers. Because if we don't have that, then every time we legislate, to go back to the issue of legislation again, it's unclear the philosophical framework within which we've decided to do that. Now, as I say, my view of this is that you've got to tilt the system and rebalance it significantly. But that is a view that is obviously strongly open to challenge, and I think it's good if we have the debate. But the reason why I get frustrated by this sometimes is that, and it goes back to the original point that Alan was making to me, you see, I don't think that the systems within the Home Office are the total answer. As I said in my Bristol speech, they are part of the answer. But if you haven't got the legal framework right within which these systems are operating, they face an uphill struggle, is the reality of it.
Can we turn to another aspect, the way you do things, Mr. Yeo?
Yes, a rather important aspect of current policy, which is the nuclear review. It's right, is it not, that you see a new generation of nuclear power stations as an important part of your political legacy?
But I don't know if it's an important part of the legacy or not. I mean, I think it's difficult for me to see, on the basis of the evidence now, that we can have secure energy supplies or tackle climate change effectively without replacing our nuclear power stations.
And that actually was a view that you'd formed before you embarked on the review, was it not? I mean, you and the Chief Scientist, David King, were determined that we should have a new generation of nuclear power stations, and the review has been a device so you can try and deflect some of the opposition within your own party.
Look, when you decide to have a review, right, into a particular aspect of policy, so A4 sure, right, it's an area that you've decided requires rethinking, otherwise you wouldn't be reviewing it. Now, I won't hide from you, my thought was, look, things are changing so fast in relation to climate change and energy security, I think it's time to rethink this. But obviously if the review had come out with evidence that showed this was a bad idea, I mean, we haven't published the review yet, but the first cuts of it I've already talked about, then of course my mind would be differently made up. But I think when you look at the evidence, it's very hard to see how you're going to get to where collectively as a country we've decided we want to be, namely with more secure energy supplies and tackling greenhouse gas emissions without replacing nuclear power. But if the review came out with evidence that showed that was a bad idea and that was not the way to go, well, it wouldn't be what we'd do.
Though what you just said, of course, is completely counter to what was said in the 2003 Energy White Paper.
Well, it's not completely counter to it, but you're absolutely right in saying that whereas we left the question open and were very sceptical at that point, certainly, I mean, I'll be absolutely open with you. I've changed my mind. I mean, I think that the fact of what I see happening in energy supply today and my appreciation of the science of climate change, and I think that the intensity and urgency of that challenge mean for me that unless someone can show to me through energy efficiency and renewables you're going to be able to cure the whole of this problem, then I think that nuclear power goes back on the agenda. Yeah, I mean, I do think that.
I think what you said this morning, though, will reinforce the fear in people's minds that this is essentially a decision about nuclear. You didn't challenge my description of what actually was announced as the energy review when I described it as a nuclear review. There are actually very considerable concerns outside that by focusing so much on nuclear, the government will not either recognise its failure to follow up the 2003 White Paper, which did put an emphasis on energy efficiency, which hasn't been followed through in policy. And the danger now is that having said, OK, we're going to have some more nuclear, let's tick that box, and you can ignore the other very important aspects that the review should be dealing with.
Well, I don't agree with that, Tim, at all. First of all, let me just make it absolutely clear. The review will deal and I think people will be quite surprised at some of its conclusions on energy efficiency and renewables, and will deal with them every bit as radically as anything to do with nuclear. Secondly, I don't actually accept we've done nothing on energy efficiency since then. I think we've done significant amounts. But I agree, one of the reasons for the review was not just about nuclear. It was to do with the whole issue to do with energy. As I say, there are two things that are making energy policy at the top of the agenda of every single major Western country. One is the fact that energy prices have something like doubled or trebled in the past few years, and if you see what is happening, for example, with China and the Chinese economy, this is going to get an even bigger issue in the years to come. And the second thing is climate change. And 4 years ago, I don't know that we had these discussions 4 years ago. Did we have these discussions 4 years ago? Probably not. But anyway, if we'd been talking about this 4 years ago, I doubt in a meeting like this, I doubt energy policy would have featured. But I can tell you, and I can't remember a European Council a few years ago where we were discussing energy policy. It is now on the agenda of every single European Council. It will dominate the G8 that we're going to have in a few days' time. And here we are discussing it. And the reason for that is that things have changed.
Well, all of which makes it disappointing. We haven't done more.
Jim, I'm sorry. We have to move on.
Miller, each have a point I want to put to you on this.
This has been very interesting what you just said, Prime Minister. You've actually told us you did prejudge the energy review, which is fascinating. And surely
Actually,
a
I
stable...
didn't, as a matter of fact.
Well, you actually did. You said you had made up your mind you wanted nuclear, and the review was to determine whether or not it proved you were right or wrong.
No, what I said was, I believed that because of the way that the changes had happened, I couldn't see how we were going to be able to meet our targets both on energy security and on climate change without going back to the nuclear option. But of course, if the review were to prove that that was the wrong thing to do, it wouldn't be the thing that we would do. But, there is a sort of slight, as I say, a slight air of unreality about this in the sense that you normally commission a review because you have formed the opinion that things have to change.
But no one said publicly at the time the review was commissioned. It was to prove your view that we needed nuclear power.
Well,
and the
consensus
that's emerging during this review process is we need technology neutrality, actually, from government policy, and the market will then determine what is the appropriate generating framework to provide energy requirements. Jonathan Porritt told my committee that the way in which the government is handling the process around the review is not clever. It's allowing an awful lot of people to assume the assumption was wrong. That's an impartial process. And then exercise in rubber stamping decisions taken at a higher level. He said, should there be falling short on that score, that's transparency, the government will be its own worst enemy because of it, because people need to be taken along in this process. You describe your language at the CBI dinner as more to do with bad American films than with proper government. Is this the right way to build a consensus for a very controversial policy?
Peter, look, in the end, people have to make their minds up. I mean, I know people always want to take refuge in decision-making in the process. Look, in the end, like anything in the world in which we live, you conduct all these debates with great, public attention and public controversy. But in the end, there's a simple question that everyone's going to have to face up to. Over the next few years, three things are going to happen.
I think we know what the question is, Prime Minister.
Yeah, but it's the answers that you have to come up with at some point when you're sitting in my seat. Anyway.
Mr. Miller.
As you said, Prime Minister, the energy paper left open the option of nuclear build. One of the questions that was posed in the consultation paper published in January was, are there particular considerations that should apply to nuclear as the government re-examines the issues bearing on new build, including long-term liabilities and waste management? If so, what are these and how should the government address them? 5,300 people responded to that review. Could we have 5,301? What advice are you receiving on these rather important points?
On nuclear waste and decommissioning and so on?
On the liabilities and waste management side.
Well, the truth again here is that because we have got our existing stock of nuclear power stations, then we will have to deal with these issues of decommissioning and waste management and so on. And one of the issues, obviously, is that the new generation of nuclear power stations do generate, I think, around about 10% of the waste of the old ones. And also, of course, I think the technology in dealing with waste management may change over the years to come. But the advice that we receive will obviously that there will be the energy review, but then also quorum will make its decisions as well. And we are going to have to deal with it. But my point about, this is why I think it's important to talk about the replacement of the nuclear power stations, we're going to have to deal with that in any event. I mean, even if we decide we're going to allow the nuclear power stations to be phased out.
The next section.
When you first took office, you told your ministers that their duty was to uphold the highest standards in public life. Since then, we've had a spate of resignations from the Cabinet, including 2 members of the Cabinet who've resigned twice, each of which you have sought to prevent. And the chairman of the Committee on Standards in Public Life has said that in his opinion, you see standards as a peripheral issue, not worthy of serious consideration. Now, that's a fairly serious charge. How do you respond?
Well, I just totally disagree with it. I do see it as extremely important. But I also think it is important that you take action on the basis of evidence and not on the basis of whatever story is in the media from time to time, which is this government and the previous governments have found can be quite difficult to deal with sometimes.
Well, in relation to looking at the facts and taking evidence, earlier this year you appointed Sir John Bourne to be an advisor on ministerial interests and to investigate specific cases. That was something which was welcomed, even though it was 3 years after the committee had originally recommended it should take place. Now, since then, Lord Sainsbury has admitted that he has broken the ministerial code, and the question of whether or not John Prescott has broken the ministerial code has been investigated by the Permanent Secretary. Wouldn't it be better if Sir John himself were able to initiate an investigation rather than waiting, in these cases in vain, for you to invite him to do so?
Well, look, John, the difficulty in this area is this, that allegations are made against ministers the entire time. And if you have somebody who is going to be investigating each one of these allegations, as you often find, it's not as if everyone shuts up and lets them get on with the investigation and then after a period of calm and quiet they come out with a decision. What actually happens is that these things are done in a pretty high-octane way, day after day after day. And if I think there is reason to believe that someone has broken the ministerial code, I will take action. If I think it's appropriate to bring in Sir John, I will do that. But I'm not going to do that every time someone makes an allegation.
Well, just to take 2 recommendations which might help to restore public confidence in the system, which I think you would probably accept is lacking at present. Sir Alistair has said that the reports of the advisor should be published and that the opposition parties should be consulted before any successor is appointed to Sir Alistair. Are those 2 recommendations ones that you would accept?
Well, I will think about both of those. I mean, I hadn't actually reflected particularly on the latter one, which doesn't sound completely unreasonable to me, actually, I must say. But look, again, you will form your own experience since you were, I think, working. Were you a special advisor or something?
Political secretary.
Political secretary, right. I don't know quite how much of this I really should say, but my experience is that every time you try to introduce a new system or a new way of becoming more open, more accountable, the credit you get for it in terms of restoring trust in public life is somewhat limited. But anyway, I'm happy to look again.
Thank you. Perfectly timed. We move now on to the next section, which is chaired by John Denham, and it's counter-terrorism strategy.
Prime Minister, obviously the timing of this session means that everybody is thinking in part about the appalling events of last year's London bombings and the victims and their families. It is now nearly a year since those atrocious attacks. What would you say you have achieved in the past year in the attempt to make us safer?
Well, I think that the most important thing is that the security services and the police have carried out their tasks in, as ever in my view, in an exemplary way, and have actually protected us against further attack, although we know there are people who may contemplate such a thing in our country. I also think that there is, but I don't put it higher than this, and I think it's something I've no doubt we will explore now. I think there is a greater sense of a debate, particularly within the Muslim community, about extremism and how it should be combated. And in addition to that, I think that there is also, and was after July the 7th, a very clear sense in the country that we want to resolve this issue in a way that keeps the country together rather than pitting communities against each other.
So just observe in passing that you didn't mention last year's terrorism legislation as a particularly significant event in making us more
Well,
secure.
of course it is. I mean, it's very important in terms of our ability to defeat terrorism. But I mean, that, in a sense, is part of the work that the police and the security services do in applying that legislation. But I think, and as I say, I'm very happy to get into this, I think the roots of this extremism lie in attitudes and ideas as much as organisation. And I don't think there is an answer to this terrorism that is simply about police work or security measures.
Right, thank you, Rose. Well, you say, Prime Minister, there are people planning attacks. The London bombers were British. The people who are accused of being would-be bombers are either British or have been brought up here. The police tell us that other young British people are planning attacks. And the truth is, we can be pretty certain, can't we, as we sit here, that there are young British people who are actively planning and would like to get away with similar terrorist outrages.
Well, there's no doubt, as the police said yesterday, there are people, there are groups that we believe are engaged in planning this type of activity.
And there's a poll in the papers today saying that 13% of Muslims regard those who killed themselves and other people last year as martyrs. You have to ask the question why the government appears to have actually done so little to win hearts and minds in the year that's passed since last July.
Well, I'll tell you my view, again, very, very bluntly. First of all, let us be very clear, as the poll also shows, the overwhelming majority of Muslims utterly abhor this extremism, are completely opposed to the fanaticism that gives rise to it, and are completely on the same side as everybody else in wanting to defeat it. But the government has its role to play in this. But honestly, the government itself is not going to defeat this. And if this is my view, again, I set it out in a speech I made in March. If you want to defeat this extremism, you've got to defeat its ideas, and you've got to defeat, in particular, a completely false sense of grievance against the West. And that has to be done, yes, by government, but it also has to be done by mobilising that moderate majority within the Muslim community to go into the community and take these people head on, not just in terms of their methods, but in terms of their ideas, in terms of their sense of grievance against the West, the whole basis of that ideology, because this is a global ideology that we're fighting.
And last summer, Prime Minister, you went to representatives of that part of the Muslim community and you invited them to form working groups under the title Preventing Extremism Together. Why did you do that?
Because it's important that we facilitate as much dialogue as we can with the Muslim community, and I've done meetings with young Muslims up in the north. I had a meeting with Muslim women, which I found absolutely fascinating in Downing Street. And if anyone wants to know, how false the view is that Muslims as a whole are in favour of this type of extremism, speaking and talking to these women who were devout Muslims but who were completely opposed to this entire extremist ideology. But I come back to the point that I made a moment or two ago, because again, I think there is a tendency for people to want an easy solution to this. This is a global movement with an ideology. It is not a British movement. It is a worldwide movement. There is a reason why these people are being picked up in Canada as well as the UK. There is a reason why they were plotting terrorist activities in Spain even after the Spanish had withdrawn their troops from Iraq. There is a reason why in countless countries throughout the world, like Egypt and Indonesia and so on, who have nothing to do with foreign policy decisions of the West, these terrorist acts are happening.
That may well be true, Prime Minister, but you invited representatives of what you call, quite rightly, the Muslim majority to advise the government on what needed to be done and what help they needed in taking on the task that you've talked about. When they reported, the group said, the working groups are united in urging the government to engage with Muslim communities at all levels in a sustained dialogue and not as a one-off event. It is imperative to recognise that this report is regarded as the initiation of a long-term process. actually the reality, Prime Minister, isn't it, is that those that took part in in those working groups overwhelmingly feel that they were brought in for short-term purposes, and the reports have not been followed through, and most of the recommendations have not been implemented.
Well, I keep reading this, but actually if you look at the recommendations, I think there were 64 of them. Many of them are obviously for the community itself to take forward. In respect to the ones to do with government, we are taking them forward, apart from some like a public inquiry where we obviously don't agree with what's being recommended. But you know, the idea that we are not trying to engage with the Muslim community, I mean, we are trying to engage with them, but in the end, this is something that government itself cannot go and root out the extremism in these communities. I mean, I am probably not the person to go into the Muslim community and persuade them that this extreme view of Islam is completely mistaken and completely contrary to the proper tenets of the religion of Islam. It is better that you mobilise the Islamic community itself to do this.
But the problem is, Prime Minister, they produce these reports, and on page after page there are recommendations not of how the government should do this job for the Muslim community, you're absolutely right about that, but of the support that the Muslim community wanted in doing this job. And most of those recommendations have not been implemented. The government has never produced any sort of action plan, any timescale for implementing those recommendations.
I don't agree with that, John. I mean,
you don't? Well,
no.
There isn't, to the best of my knowledge, an action plan or a timescale or any report of what's been achieved.
Well, there is a systematic taking forward of the recommendations with which we agree. I mean, let me give you an example of one that came to fruition last week, and that is to do with the advisory board of imams and mosques in respect of those people who go and preach in mosques. For example, in relation to the engagement with the Muslim community, there are ministers engaging with this all over the country. I mean, I just profoundly disagree that the problem here is that the government hasn't acted. That is not the problem. The problem is that we are not having, in my view, this is the problem, we're not having a debate of a fundamental enough nature within the community itself where the moderate majority actually go and stand up against the ideas of these people, not just their methods.
Don't you recognise, Prime Minister, the difficulty is that those that you asked and who willingly came forward to be in the front line in that discussion feel let down? I mean, Sadiq Khan, your and my Labour colleague, is not a wild radical, but he talked last night of the danger of the government looking like the Grand Old Duke of York, leading these moderate leaders up the hill and down again and leaving them high and dry. Do you not recognise that there is a sense of disillusionment amongst the very people that you asked to go into the forefront of that ideological battle for hearts and minds?
Well, the point that Sadiq was making actually was specifically on the public inquiry, and we can come to that and I can explain the reasons why I am wholly opposed to such a thing taking place. I don't accept that we are not engaging with the Muslim community, and I honestly, I mean, I do say this to you. It is, I know everyone always wants to blame the government for absolutely everything that is happening, and I'm not saying we don't have a huge responsibility which we're trying to discharge in, as I say, having a dialogue with the Muslim community and trying to make sure that we engage with the reasons for this extremism. But I just say to you, my view in the end is you cannot defeat this extremism through whatever a government does. You can only defeat it if there are people inside the community who are going to stand up, and this is what is difficult, and I'm afraid this is, in my view, what has to happen, but it is difficult, who are going to stand up and not merely say, you are wrong to kill people through terrorism, you are wrong to incite terrorism or extremism, but actually you're wrong in your view about the West, you're wrong in this sense of grievance that people play on within the community as if Muslims were oppressed by the West. The whole sense of grievance, the ideology is wrong, profoundly wrong. There may be disagreements that you have with America, with the UK, with the Western world, but none of it justifies not merely the methods, but the ideas which are far too current within parts of the community. Now, my view is until you challenge that at its root, fundamentally, then you're always going to be left in a situation where people say, and you can see this in some of the comments that are made, I mean, I won't single any out, where people kind of say, I mean, I'm putting it maybe in a harsher way than I mean to, but I'm doing it to make a point. They kind of say, look, we understand why you feel like this, and you know, we can sympathise with that, but you're wrong to do these things. You're not going to defeat it like that. You're only going to defeat it if you say you're actually wrong to feel those things.
Right. Prime Minister, just as you may not be the person to go and win all the arguments in the community, I'm not necessarily the person to speak for the people in the working group, although I've met many of them. Can I ask you this, Prime Minister? If you are as confident as you are in the progress that has been made since last summer, are you prepared to meet again with all the people you invited to be in those working groups to discuss with them where they feel progress has got to?
Yeah, of course, I'm very happy to do that, and I know that government ministers do meet people the whole time, but sometimes in some of the recommendations that are made, I mean, you will have a disagreement, and
of course.
And what Sadiq actually singled out was this issue of the public inquiry, and as I say, I mean, I'm very happy to give my reasons as to why this is not the right thing to do.
We may come back to the public inquiry, but that's helpful. Can I ask one other question in the same area? Last year, Prime Minister, you proposed the establishment of a commission on integration. It's never met. It's just not a priority for you, is it?
It certainly is a priority to make sure that people integrate, and part of the reason for the whole of the working groups and so on was to explore ways that people can integrate. And I thought one of the most encouraging things about the poll that was done in the newspapers this morning was the view of most Muslims that they want to integrate, and I think this is, it's a part of a far bigger picture, but we do have to be very specific about this. You know, there is an issue to do with integration, which, again, if we want to deal with this, we've got to deal with it. You know, it's like...
No, that's my point is, Prime Minister, I welcomed it last year when you proposed the establishment of a commission on integration and cohesion. I'm just asking why, more than 6 months after you proposed it, it has never met.
Yeah, but
I don't even think it has a membership as yet.
But because what we decided to do was the process of engagement with the Muslim community, and rather than establish, as it were, a specific commission that is going to look at the issues to do with integration, before you get the feedback from the working groups, look first of all at what they're saying. And the other thing I just point out to you, John, is that not all the groups agree with each other. That's the other problem. It's not clear to me that there is one unified view within the community, actually, as to how to proceed.
I'm sure there isn't, Prime Minister. I'm just trying to establish why you proposed something in this area more than 6 months ago, which has never met.
Oh, and the reason I'm giving is that we think it's best to get the feedback from the groups first, and then we can see how we take it forward.
Okay, Prime Minister, amongst the conclusions of the working groups was that though their remit was to tackle extremism and radicalism, most of the strands, that's most of the working groups, saw that solutions lie in the medium to longer term issues of tackling inequality, discrimination, deprivation and inconsistent government policy. And to pursue some of those, I'll turn to Dr. Phyllis Starkey.
Prime Minister, yes. John Denham has pointed to one of the key recommendations of the strategy recommended by the working groups, which was eliminating discrimination against Muslims, promoting equality of treatment, opportunity and outcomes between British Muslims and other members of society. Do you accept that achieving equality of opportunity and outcome is a key part of the strategy to win hearts and minds?
Yes, I do.
Well, in that case, can I focus on one particular aspect, which is employment? A report which is funded by the Department for Community and Local Government and published in April this year showed that unemployment rates are higher for Muslims than any other part of the population. And where they are in work, Muslims are concentrated in low-pay sectors like catering, transport and hotels, and a higher proportion are in part-time work than the population at large. So what action are you asking the government to take to target action to close the employment gap between Muslims and the rest of the community?
Well, first of all, I think the issue is actually very stark, and indeed I think if you look, for example, at levels of women's employment in the Muslim community, they are far below, maybe even half or under half as much as in the community as a whole. And we are, through the funding of groups, through obviously programs like the New Deal, programs like Sure Start and so on, which we have got in the Muslim communities, we are trying to make sure that those gaps are bridged. I mean, some of the raising of standards in the local schools is very important to doing that. But I want to come back, and again, I may offend people by saying this, part of the answer to this also lies within the community itself. I mean, we can put in programs, but you need community leaders who are also going to be saying, we actually need to make sure that, for example, women get the opportunities that they require to go out and work and to get the training and help that they need to do so.
I wouldn't necessarily dissent from the action we're taking about encouraging Muslim women to get into work, but you've avoided the issue of male unemployment in the Muslim community, which is 13% male unemployment among Muslims compared with 3 to 8% for other groups. Now that's a different issue.
Mm-hmm.
What I'm asking you again, what are we doing to target measures at encouraging and helping Muslim men to get into work at the same rate as other men in Britain?
Well, the very programs that we have, we put in place, for example, like the New Deal, in the areas where the highest levels of unemployment are, and that includes the Muslim community. And, you know, again, if there are further things that people would like us to do, we're very happy to look at doing them.
Well, I've brought this point up in all our previous meetings,
Yeah.
Prime Minister. I accept the New Deal is doing valuable work. I'm asking what we're doing to target specifically Muslims, because there are innumerable examples which demonstrate that unless things are targeted at that group, then the gap between them and the rest of the community will remain. And if I can point you to a rather different situation than disadvantaged communities with high levels of unemployment, and that's Slough, which is like the powerhouse of the UK in the southeast, where last week the chief executive of Slough Borough Council drew attention to the impact that an influx of migrant workers from the EU accession country was having on employment rates in Slough, and showing that she was particularly concerned by Pakistani employment rates, which have fallen over the last few months. So in other words, that particular part of the community in Slough, whose economy is amazingly strong, which was already at a disadvantage, in response to a new challenge, has suffered a greater disadvantage than the rest of the population. Unless action is targeted at those specific groups, just having the New Deal, which is targeted at all people who are out of work, is not reaching that group.
Well, it's important, obviously, that we examine that very carefully indeed. The only thing I would say to you, though, Phyllis, is that the whole point about these programs is that they do go into the areas of most difficulty, or, for example, if people have difficulty with English as a language, there are programs that are specifically targeted on those people. But it's not only, I mean, you can get other pockets of deprivation and unemployment that aren't limited to, for example, the Muslim community or the Pakistani community or the Bangladeshi community in certain instances. And look, I agree, it is important that we target programs. I think, I mean, I can get you the list of all the fundings we give to particular groups that are, and voluntary organisations in the Muslim community that help tackle some of this. But my point is that it also requires a very clear response from the community itself.
Can I just interject on this? Is this a question of joined-up government? Isn't the fact we have a migration policy that still encourages unskilled young men and women, particularly young men, to come from the Indian subcontinent, large numbers of them, they turn up here with no English, no skills, a history perhaps in agriculture, and they soon become unemployed. And that is a very real problem of matching migration policy with what we can do with education, shore staff, and all the other things.
But it's the importance of the points-based system that we're introducing to migration now that will make sure that actually people, if they haven't got an employment opportunity, don't come here.
With respect, Prime Minister, can I get you back to the CRE has actually shown that even when you take into account educational qualifications, fluency in English, etc., Pakistani and Bangladeshi citizens fare worse in employment, earnings and career protection. So the point with respect made by my colleague there is a diversion. There is a difficulty, there is discrimination against those communities, even when they have the qualifications, they fare less well. Although, of course, it's important to help people without qualifications to get more.
Yeah,
and we're constantly sliding away from it and saying it's the community's fault.
No, I'm not saying
the evidence demonstrates the opposite.
Well, I'm not saying it's the community's fault. I'm not saying that. Let me make that clear. But I think it's quite a big leap from describing the problem to saying it's as a result of discrimination, which is what you're saying. I mean, I'm not sure I agree with that. I mean, the fact is there are programs that by their very nature will be targeted on the areas of most disadvantage. And if that is in respect to the Muslim population, then that's where those programs will go. But it's not, you know, if you were to take the issue, and I'm sorry, I don't raise it to divert from the issue you're asking me about, but if you were to take the issue of the low levels of employment amongst women in the Muslim community, that is not simply to do with discrimination in my view.
No, but if you talk about male unemployment,
but
that is not a factor. And the CRE report clearly shows, as I say, that when you take into account, when you match all the reasons which might make it more difficult for an individual to be employed, you finish up with evidence that if you are Pakistani or Bangladeshi, you are likely to be worse off in employment, earnings and career projection than somebody with comparable qualifications who is not Pakistani or Bangladeshi.
I totally agree with that, and that's the reason why the programs that we have, which are not, I agree, Pakistani specific in that case, but do of course impact enormously on those communities, are precisely to help that. But all I'm saying is that the only way of dealing with them ultimately is also a partnership with the local community.
Well, can I take you up on that then? The Muslim Council of Britain had a report, Voices from the Minarets, which pointed out that mosques are a valuable community resource and that some sections of the Muslim community do find it difficult to access mainstream services that were, and I quote, culturally incompetent or insensitive. So are you encouraging mainstream services where appropriate to work more closely with mosques so as to make the services more culturally appropriate?
We really do try to make sure that local schools are very, very sensitive to the needs of their local communities, and I think most schools are. I mean, interestingly, when I had the process of engagement with Muslim women in Downing Street, they had two issues about this. One was that they thought it was important, obviously, that the local schools were sensitive to the needs of Muslim children. They actually had a different and almost an opposite worry as well, which is that it was important that the mosques too were sensitive to the fact that there had to be proper education for their kids, and their kids actually were going to benefit from being in mainstream education.
But I'm not talking about children, I'm talking about adults who need to upskill and who find it difficult with the services currently provided. Are you going to suggest that government departments providing adult training where many of these communities find it difficult to access, work more closely?
Yeah, I totally understand what you're saying, Phyllis, and I don't really disagree with the need to make sure that we target things properly. Perhaps the best thing for me to do is actually to get someone to do for me the programs that are there specifically for the Muslim community and on issues to do with skills and pathways into employment and so on. Because I don't mean to suggest just because you've got a general program it necessarily fits the specific, but my point is that these programs are designed actually to target the most disadvantaged groups. The only thing I'm saying, and I would say this in respect of male unemployment as well, is that I think there is an issue to do with the partnership with the community, which is going to be very, very important. And, you know, well, there are a whole series of questions that we have to engage with, I think, to get this right, including the relationship between the mosques and the schools. But you need to get that balance, you know, properly done. Otherwise, there's a danger too in that.
Prime Minister, taking up the theme of partnership with the community, but in a rather different area of intelligence and policing, one of the things that is clearly necessary is for information to be provided to the police and security services. It seems difficult to me to see how we can completely avoid events like Forest Gate, where the police feel impelled to go in on what perhaps turns out to be dodgy information. But how can we sustain community confidence in providing information to the police if people feel that operations of that sort are going to take place? It just seems to be a genuine dilemma, and how do you expect that to be resolved by the various people involved?
Well, I think that is a very fair point, and it is extremely difficult. But you see, this is where I think this process of engagement with the community has to be done on a very careful basis. I mean, I may be wrong in this, and there are others better qualified to speak on it than me, but I suspect actually that most Muslims would recognise that Forest Gate in a sense, had to happen given the information that the police had. And really what I'm trying to say is part of the problem here is that the way that this discourse happens, and in particular because anybody who is prepared to come out and be critical is going to get a higher profile than anybody who's not, the way the discourse happens is actually the least helpful for the police trying to do their job. I mean, the truth is, the police, if they receive this information, what can they do? They're bound to go and investigate and take whatever action. And actually, if they didn't, most people would say, well, they were not performing their duty properly. But I think, what this comes back to is this whole business of the relationship between the community and wider society and this issue to do with, is it because there is a problem between the West and the Muslim world that these issues are more difficult to resolve? And my point about this is that there is an issue to do with the West and the Muslim world, and it does make these issues more difficult to resolve. But you're absolutely right. There's no way round the situation in Forest Gate, and we are going to have to work very, very hard to make sure that the community understands why these things are done, and obviously the engagement between the police and the community is an important part of that.
Finally, from me, Prime Minister, we know that you don't like public inquiries. I mean, that's sort of full stop, really. But there has been...
Well, my experience of them is... Well,
yes,
anyway.
But there has been a call from victims' families and also from the Muslim working groups for public inquiry, not just into intelligence and policing issues, but into the underlying reasons why such an event as last year's bombings could happen. You may not like public inquiries, but it would meet a demand from an awful lot of people to have such an inquiry. Why is your opposition so implacable when it would seem to be a very positive gesture both towards victims and the wider community?
I believe that if we had a public inquiry, we would divert enormous amounts of resource, energy, commitment from the police, the security services. I believe at the moment we have a clear active threat. I want our police and our security services focused on dealing with that threat. If they end up being engaged in a public inquiry, the reality is no matter what people might want or say they want at the outset, is that the resource and commitment and energy of those services will be diverted into that in circumstances where we know what has happened. Now, because the identities of these 4 people that carried out the atrocity are known. And I totally understand, particularly when families are reading constant reports in the media about pieces of information that the security services had that they didn't act on. Each and every one of these stories is wrong and false. There was no CIA block of Mohammed Sadiq Khan going into America. There was no device in his car planted before 7/7. There was no information given to the police before 7/7 about what they were up to. Each of these stories is just simply wrong. I understand when people are reading this, though, they think there's some great conspiracy going on or some information we're not getting. And so I totally understand, particularly in the tragic circumstances of people still grieving and mourning and angry about the victims of this, why they might want a public inquiry. But my worry, and why I think it would not be responsible to do it, is that you end up diverting this vast amount of energy and resource into something that is, I'm afraid, in the end going to tell you what we already know, which is that these 4 individuals went and committed this act.
Thank you, Prime Minister. The wreckage caused by terrorism lasts a very long time, and we'd like to use the last few minutes of this session to look at the situation at the moment in Northern Ireland. So I'll go to Sir Patrick Cormack.
Yes, Prime Minister, and I think what we just said about public inquiries could be perhaps illustrated by Bloody Sunday, the amount of time and money that took. Prime Minister, you have invested a great deal of your personal energy into trying to bring about a solution in Northern Ireland. and you have had the broad general support of members in all parts of the House, and most will hope that your November the 24th deadline will be met. But of course what you are working for is a situation where people who have been convicted sometimes of pretty heinous terrorist acts, and others who have supported them and given succour, will possibly be sitting down in an assembly, maybe even in a power-sharing executive with others. Is it not absolutely essential, therefore, that those people should unequivocally repudiate criminality and any association with it?
Yes, they've got to abide by the commitment to exclusively peaceful and democratic means. And we have the ability through the Independent Monitoring Commission to see whether the undertakings and commitments that have been given by the IRA are being fulfilled.
But the Independent Monitoring Commission, even in its latest and most positive report, has indicated that there are a considerable number of individuals on both the so-called loyalist and the Republican side who have been paramilitaries are still involved. And my committee has recently completed an inquiry into organised crime. We publish a report in Armagh tomorrow, and without anticipating our findings, it is quite clear from the evidence that's been published, and much of it's been heard in camera, but the evidence published is that there is this continuing involvement. Therefore, what are you going to do to give confidence to the community at large? Are you going to insist that before a power-sharing executive comes about, there has to be a signing up to the police board by Sinn Féin? Are you going to insist that there has to be an unequivocal pledge to abide by the rule of law and sign up to the rule of law by those who would sit in government over their fellows?
This is obviously the nub of the issue that's still got to be resolved. We can't impose a formal precondition because the conditions are the ones set out already in the agreements that have been made. And the problem on the policing board is that Sinn Féin want the devolution of justice and policing, and the unionists are hesitant about that. And both sides' positions are completely understandable. But I agree that it is important that Sinn Féin make it clear that they are against criminality of any kind, and that those who are engaged in criminality should be pursued with the full force of the law.
But they haven't made it unequivocally clear either that they are utterly opposed, nor that they would wish them to be pursued in that way. And well, so how can you expect the rest of the community, including those law-abiding, democratic nationalists who vote perfectly honourably, SDLP, election after election, how can you expect them to have trust and confidence unless there is this unequivocal commitment?
Well, I think that's the issue. If you're trying to build confidence, I mean, leave aside preconditions, but this never works unless there's confidence, because then you can't force people to go into government.
Well, then why, Prime Minister, do you persist with Sinn Féin? I mean, if Sinn Féin will sign up, fine. I accept one has to draw lines. I accept people with murky past may have to play a part in the government part of the United Kingdom. I accept that. But if they will not do these things, there are other law-abiding democratic parties in Northern Ireland who could be encouraged to coalesce and form a government with Sinn Féin in opposition. So why do you persist if they will not sign up?
First of all, I think the reality is that there is no way of getting a government in Northern Ireland that does not have Sinn Féin as part of it. I mean, I've been over this territory now for almost a decade, and every time you come to the crunch point, the truth is there isn't really a consensus for a government that excludes them. However, you are right in saying, and this is a point we constantly make, that if people want the right confidence to be there to go into government, then the logic of what the IRA have done up to now has to be followed through. And that logic is that if they're not engaged in criminality or terrorism, then if crimes are committed, the police should be given support in bringing to justice those who commit those crimes. Now, that is, I'm trying to use my words carefully because this is, of course, part of the discussion that now needs to take place over the next few months. But the difficulty that you've got is that, it's just so that one puts the thing in its full perspective, is that Sinn Féin say, yes, we will sign up to policing once it's devolved, but the unions say we don't agree with it being devolved, or not at this stage. And therefore it's slightly more complicated than Sinn Féin simply saying we're not backing the police. However, having said that, I agree with you, it would be far more easy to get the right confidence that allows this thing to go forward, if indeed it were the case that everybody said, for example, if somebody is robbed or mugged in a Catholic or Republican area, that the police should be given support in bringing the perpetrator of that crime to justice.
Yes, and you would accept that it will be very difficult to envisage a government of any part of the United Kingdom containing within it people who are not signed up to the rule of law. And so will you give an absolute undertaking that you will do all you can over the next few months to get that unequivocal undertaking?
Well, I will do all I can to make sure that people understand that you can't pick and choose in the rule of law.
Okay.
And you know, none of this has been easy over the past few years, because it gets at points very difficult to work out and pick a way through. But the one thing I'm absolutely sure of is that there is no real reason now why people can't, as I say, just follow through the logic of the position and get agreement.
Thank you. We now move on to the third section, migration and population policy. Gwyneth.
Prime Minister, precisely what is Her Majesty's Government's policy on mass migration?
To control it so that the people that come into the country are the people we want and need, and to do our level best to prevent illegal migration.
So you really have an upper limit. You don't consider that mass migration is needed for economic reasons?
Yes, I think that there is migration that's needed for economic reasons, but that there should be those economic reasons, and it shouldn't happen in an uncontrolled way.
Now, you know that migration quite often means that people concentrate in areas which are already socially deprived. They have difficulty with housing, they have difficulty with social services. And you know that we've had, for example, an influx of Polish workers greater than some say of any previous movement for many, many years. Who deals with coordinating policies in Whitehall that are responsible for that kind of immigration?
Well, the Home Office obviously deals with the issue of migration, but across government, both the local government department and the Home Office look at how you deal with the consequences of this. And I actually think there is one of the things we're looking at specifically at the moment is how we deal with the areas, and you were mentioning Slough. I think John had the issue down in Southampton, which I know he wrote to me about, and as a result of the letter he wrote, we are looking now at how we manage better this process, because I agree it's very, very difficult. There comes enormous pressure on local authorities and so on.
But Prime Minister, it's not being managed at all, is it? Even in an area like Crewe, we have a large influx of Polish workers. They have no support from the social services system. Why should they? They haven't contributed. They have to find their own housing. They are brought in by agencies who charge them for accommodation and transport and everything else they can think of, and leave them with hardly any money at all. Who's dealing with that problem in Whitehall? It's not just a Home Office problem.
Well, it's not just a Home Office problem. It's not only the Home Office that deal with it. But the fact is we can't stop people coming from the European countries that have come into the European Union coming to our country.
Other nations, of course, have done, but we've decided there should be no bar.
No, it's very important we get this clear. I mean, the free movement of people has been there for all the countries in Europe. So there's no reason why Polish people or Czechs or Slovaks can't move around Europe absolutely freely. Free movement of workers, the ability to work, there were transition periods that some countries agreed, but most of those countries have now either come into line with what we're doing, or even through the barriers they put in place. I think I was reading the other day that Germany has got somewhere in the region of 500,000 work permits that is given to East Europeans. So we're all facing the same issue as a result of the membership of the European Union. However, on the whole, I think a lot of that migration has also been beneficial for our economy.
Yes, Prime Minister, in my constituency, schools are closing and then suddenly receiving large influxes of children they haven't planned for. Now, is there a minister with special responsibility for coordination across the Home Office, social services, benefits, that can easily, education as well, who can demonstrate that they have a coordinated policy, that they are very happy to accept for economic reasons these migrants, but they are going to give support to the local government areas concerned? Who is it?
Well, the Home Office and the Department for Local Government, Communities and Local Government do work very, very closely on it. But there's a limit to what they can do, because it's not clear always where the people will go, and where they do go, and for example there's then pressure on the local school, then yes, of course the Department of Education is brought in as well.
Well, you have yourself said that public concern is frequently generated by the perception the system's not being sufficiently managed or controlled. So what are your plans now to deal with that?
Well, I think you've got to look at migration with two quite separate dimensions. I mean, one is the dimension...
Well, you have to deal with the migration when they appear, Prime Minister.
No,
on the ground.
I understand that, Gwyneth, but there is a big difference between people who have got an absolute right to come here, which is what those people who are members of the European Union have, and other people who obviously have to go through visa requirements.
Well, at the moment, we don't seem to be doing terribly well with either. What is the coordinated plan? Let us take immigration from Eastern Europe. What local government support is being given? What services are available? What extra monies have been donated by central government, and who has the overall responsibility for deciding these priorities?
For example, in respect to the money that comes to local government, that is part of the continual discussion that the Department of Communities and Local Government has with local government about the pressures that are on them. And this is part of the perpetual negotiation when authorities come to us, as they have done recently, and said, look, there are more people here than we bargained for, and you've got to give us additional resource. And that's part of the negotiation that's gone on forever about these things. The point that I'm making to you is, though, it's a completely different situation with people coming from within the European Union than from people coming outside.
Yes, and the point I'm making to you is I see no clear indication that we have a very clear policy for either.
Well, we do actually have a clear policy for both, but I agree it's very difficult. There are huge challenges for any country at the moment dealing with mass migration, and we're not alone in that. There's a reason why it's probably the biggest issue on the agenda of most European countries, and it's the single biggest domestic issue in the United States.
So is it the government's intention to isolate specific sums of money to deal with this, and to make it very clear to the local authorities who are under pressure that they will give them extra support that is not part of their normal local government?
We do, as part of the, as I say, of the negotiation that goes on the whole time between local government and central government, when there are particular issues that come up in local authority areas, then we do and can allocate additional sums. But obviously it's a situation which you've got to negotiate on each basis, because otherwise you end up not having proper control of public money.
Well, except that the people who have children who appear on their doorstep at their schools which are about to be closed are not negotiating, are they, Prime Minister?
Well, if you've got a situation where, as a result of people coming into the country, there is pressure on a particular school, or indeed it can be pressure on the local employment circumstances, local housing is another major question and issue, then you've got to handle it as best you can. And that is a matter, as I say, for discussion between central government and local government. But there is no easy way of dealing with this.
Life is difficult, Prime Minister. You have differentiated between the two different...
Thank you for acknowledging that.
I thought it was what you were paying for. Forgive me.
Yes, absolutely.
You've differentiated between illegal migrants and the other kind. Can Mike Gapes ask you some questions on this?
Prime Minister, leaving aside the European Union migrants, you referred to people who come here with visas. Could you tell me how many people come in legally to work, to study, to join families, or as asylum seekers each year?
I mean, people who come in to study, I think... mean, I have to check the exact figures for you, but I think last year there were around about 270,000 that came into study, which is slightly down on the previous couple of years. The asylum applications last year were 25,000. But you've got basically 12 million people, or 11 to 12 million people that come in. Most come in as tourists, but then others come in for short work periods and so on.
What's your best estimate of the number of people who come in illegally, either by overstaying or by being smuggled in by people smugglers, or coming in other ways?
Well, as I always say to people, I mean, and it's not often I pray and aid Michael Howard, but I do on this occasion, when he was Home Secretary in the previous government. By the very nature, the fact that they're illegals makes it difficult to have a precise estimate. But this is, as I say, this is a problem for every single major country, and the reason's perfectly simple, because you've got millions of people who come into our country perfectly lawfully, who we want to come into our country, for reasons of trade, for reasons of studying, for reasons of tourism. The difficulty is if any of those people overstay, then you've got to have a system for checking up on it. And that's why I, to get back on one of my familiar hobby horses, in the end the only answer to this is electronic borders and identity cards. But
right.
And even then you will not have a complete answer.
The Home Office published in 2005 a study by the Migration Research Unit at the University College London that said that in 2001 their central estimate was 430,000 illegal migrants in the UK in 2001. Would you demur from that figure?
No, but I think as they also point out at the time, and that's why, I mean, this figure has been, you know, widely canvassed, the truth is you can't be absolutely sure for the very reason of the problems that you have. But one of the reasons why we have introduced the point system, why we've tightened up significantly on, for example, student visas, why we're introducing biometric visas, biometric passports, is precisely in order to make sure we have a better record. But we are in no different position. In fact, in some ways, we're in a better position than many other European countries.
The new Home Secretary, John Reid, said that illegal immigrants shouldn't be coming here. If they get here, we should find them, and when we find them, we should deport them. Given that there are hundreds of thousands of illegal immigrants in this country, many of whom may have been here several years, including people who have young children born in this country, people who've been educated entirely in this country, is it really a realistic option to find and deport hundreds of thousands of people and their families?
Well, it's extremely difficult, but on the other hand, it is important that where people are here illegally, that they are deported. I mean, part of the trouble is, though, when you do want to deport people, for very obvious reasons, you will find great local campaigns in favour of the people, and people saying, well, it's quite wrong that they're put out of the country and so on. And in the end, I mean, I think that until there is a proper system of identifying people, it's going to be very, very difficult to do.
But 2/3 of all new migrants come to London and the South East. Presumably a similar proportion of illegal migrants, or maybe even more, come to London and the South East. We know that in the London economy, which is so vital to the rest of the country, there are hundreds of thousands of people working in all kinds of jobs, many of whom may have a checkered immigration history. What's going to be the consequence of deporting hundreds of thousands of people from London and the South East?
Well, I think, Mike, you've got to look at it the other way as well. I mean, what is the consequence of saying that even if someone is an illegal migrant, you're going to allow them to stay? The consequence is you're going to get a lot more. So it's very difficult. Look, the most sensible thing for us in this particular debate is to realise the scale of the challenge and the problem. I mean, I know it's very easy for people to sit there and say, well, this Home Office official or that Home Office minister. This is, when I had the discussion with the European Council a couple of weeks ago with the European leaders, it was, the discussion over dinner was about this topic, and the Spanish led the way on it and just said, look, down in the south of Europe, we are being overwhelmed by this problem of mass migration. Now, up in the north of Europe, it's all different, and we all put our hands up and said, no, it's not. And the fact is, this is, I mean, you could take a country like Malta, a small country like Malta. I mean, this is a very, very serious issue for them right now because of the numbers of people that are coming illegally across from Africa and elsewhere. And in the end, the reason why it's so difficult is this. there are good reasons for people coming into countries today. And the majority of people, as I say, you want to come in. And therefore, the problem is, if someone, for example, comes in with a student visa and they overstay at the end of it, you need a big system to put in place to be able to go and track down that person and pick them up and put them back. And one of the reasons why I'm saying that you need to refashion all the rules around this type of situation is that the scale of what you're talking about is just a world away from 20, 30 years ago. And, I agree with you, it's very, very hard to go and deport people who may have been here for several years illegally. On the other hand, it's a very big signal to send out if you're going to say, provided you can stay here a certain length of time, even though you're an illegal, we won't do anything about you. And I think that's why, in the end, this is where Europe has got to cooperate on a far better basis to protect our borders. And in the end, as I say, here in this country, I think that, and I'm sure this will happen elsewhere as well, with the biometric technology, identity cards will be the answer, actually.
Prime Minister, in answer to Gwyneth a few moments ago, you said this was one of the greatest problems the Home Office faced, and there was a limit on what the Home Office could do about it. But isn't that limit apparently imposed by the Home Office itself, since it seems to have fallen into a shambles, according to your current Home Secretary? Why, after 9 years of your administration, does your Home Secretary say that the Home Office is dysfunctional, unfit for purpose, lacking in management systems and leadership?
What he actually said was, as a result of the scale of the challenges in mass migration, the Home Office is not fit for purpose. If you look back over the past 9 years, it's simply not true to say that nothing has happened. If you take the asylum system that we inherited from your administration, David, that system was a genuine shambles. Were you? No, you weren't a Home Office Minister.
I was Home Office Minister, and it was not a shambles, Prime Minister,
well,
with us asylum seekers what it was now.
Actually, it was a shambles. I'm so glad I remember this. Let me just tell you, when we came to office, it used to take, on average, I think I'm right, 14 months to do an asylum application, and we had a 60,000 backlog of asylum cases. Am I right?
We had fewer asylum seekers than we have now,
No,
Prime Minister.
and
we had more deportations.
The actual last figures, if you include the dependents, was for the last year of your administration, it was 40,000. It's 30,000 this year. It's actually lower. And we had a 60,000 backlog that we've taken down to 6,000, and we get 80% of the cases done within 2 months.
Prime Minister, we didn't have a report from the Home Office, an official report, saying we'd 500,000 illegal asylum seekers in this country had not been deported.
No, and I tell you why you didn't, because your Home Secretary at the time said that he actually couldn't calculate the numbers.
Prime Minister, we've had three.
David, look, there's no point in us being daft about this. The fact is,
Prime Minister,
you were trying to deal with this problem. We're trying to deal with it. Every country around the world is trying to deal. And there's no point in suggesting it's just because people are being feckless and silly. It is
no one's suggesting that, Prime Minister.
Well, I think you are trying to suggest
Can we just have one at a time? I'm happy to let you find children, but let's try and get them in some order.
Thank you, Gwyneth. Could I say that Jack Straw, an honourable and decent and straight man as Home Secretary, never made the point when he took over the Home Office that it somehow was a shambles. He wanted more legislation, quite rightly. He wanted to implement his programme. We never heard the same comment from David Blunkett or Charles Clarke. Why is it your new Home Secretary has decided that after 9 years that the Home Office is now dysfunctional and a shambles? And you can't blame that on an administration 9 years ago, when none of your other Home Secretaries made the comment.
Well, first of all, I will send you a series of the comments that David Blunkett made, and I think actually Charles himself, which suggested that the Home Office, because of the scale of the changes that are taking place and the challenges, needed fundamental change and reform. The point that I'm making to you, it's not as if, I know this is a very common way of putting it, it's what people always say. They say, oh, we've had 9 years and nothing's happened. Lots of things have happened. The asylum system is in a completely different shape from what it was, from what we inherited in 1997. But the fact is, and as I say, this is why every single country is facing the same issues, the system is very, very difficult. Now, I don't actually go back and say that everything you guys did when you were in the Home Office was wrong as well. Actually, some of the problems that Michael Howe was trying to deal with, some of the legislation actually he introduced before we came to office was exactly trying to deal with the same problems. I mean, this is a feature of the modern world.
And you scrubbed the blacklist of countries and the white list and then created the problem.
No, we didn't actually, David. What we did was, the problem with the way that your list worked was there were certain countries that you literally said we're not returning people to. And we said that in the end, this is why we introduced the non-suspensive appeal system. Look, you need to get a far faster way of dealing with these people who are coming through for and claiming asylum. And let's be absolutely clear about this. This is part of the problem. The majority of people who claim asylum turn out to have their claims unfounded. Now, let's just be clear about this before we sort of stigmatise these people. It's not because they're terrible people. They're people who, for perfectly understandable reasons, are in search of a better life. They come from very poor countries. They go abroad because they want to work hard for their families and raise their families in some sort of decency. They're basically decent people, but the trouble is they come in claiming asylum when actually they're economic migrants.
I just want to move on, Prime Minister. Dr. Wright?
We're going to enjoy ourselves there, but anyway.
Well, I rather thought you were doing that. That's why we're moving on.
I think that's a very indicative comment.
You looked to me like you were moving into automatic mode, so I thought Rowan had come to intervene. Dr. Wright.
Can I ask you, Prime Minister, does the government have a population policy?
Population policy? No, but I mean, we do have a migration policy, obviously.
You know this is political dynamite, don't you?
Well, I think it's pretty obvious, yeah. I mean, I don't know whether that's going to lead the news tomorrow as a comment, but...
So, you've been asking us to have a debate about all kinds of things as we've gone along. Why don't we have a proper debate about population and migration rather than just explode all over us every time we have an election or a crisis? Population has gone past 60 million in the last year. It's going to rise by 12% in the next generation. Every year, we're inventing a new Oxford, a new Middlesbrough, or a new Ipswich. Now, this may be a good thing. It may be a bad thing. It means that it's easier to get a waiter and it's harder to get a parking place. but what the country desperately needs is some serious debate about this, doesn't it? And we're not getting it, are we?
Well, I mean, that's the remedy lies in our own hands. We should have that debate. I'm perfectly happy to participate in it and give my views on it. And I think the most difficult thing, as you well know, Tony, is to have a debate on this topic devoid of hysteria and over emotion. The most important thing is to have a rational and sensible debate. And I think that is a very, very sensible thing to do.
Well, why don't we have, therefore, a proper cost-benefit analysis of the costs and benefits of different levels of population, most of it being fueled by migration. Perhaps have an independent commission that looks at these issues, that can inform public debate about them. Because if we don't do these things, I think we all know that the potential for nasty right-wing extremists doing things about them is there all the time, and it's going to get worse.
Yeah, the difficulty when you try to examine what is the cost and benefit is that you can look and analyse this at a number of different levels. I mean, even to what you're talking about with population growth, I mean, I don't have the exact figures in my head, but I'm not sure that the driver is simply migration or even mainly.
It's the main driver.
Well, but you've also got population...
No, the main driver is migration and the effects of migration on the birth rate.
Well, the birth rate, I was about to say, but the birth rate is different amongst different communities, but not all of those communities are necessarily people who haven't been here for some significant period of time, and indeed perfectly lawfully. I'm not sure that it is the facts in an objective sense that you need to debate. I mean, I'm very happy to look at that, but I think the facts are very difficult to be objective about in terms of what is the benefit or disbenefit of migration. My own view of this is that migration, on the whole, is positive and of benefit to countries, but it needs to be controlled. There need to be rules. And the question is, how do you impose rules in the modern world where there is this mass migration, mass travel, mass communication? Right? It's very, very difficult to do. And I think most people in the country, in fact, are not racist about this at all, actually. They just want to think that there is some order and some rules that can be brought to this situation. And the trouble is, from a policy-making point of view, is that those rules are very, very difficult. Because as I say, the moment you realise that literally 11 to 12 million people come into this country every year, you understand the scale of the problem. Because as I say, the vast bulk of those people, perfectly lawful, absolutely necessary for our economy. So I think it's the rules that are the problem, if I may say so.
Prime Minister, you're taking decisions on facts you're not sure about. I'm sure you'd never do anything like that.
No, I'm just saying facts. Facts on cost benefit are not necessarily facts. When you actually analyse them, sometimes they're opinions.
I see facts when you agree with them, and facts.
Well, I'm not saying that, but I mean, all I'm saying is, to say, I don't think you will get a factual statement as to whether migration is a good thing or a bad thing.
Finally, Mr. Shearman wants to ask you a brief question about education.
It's people in this country are very fair-minded, as you've said, and we have a very tolerant society on the whole. But they do want to see migration, that migrants that come here to have skills, to have jobs, and to become, in some way, real members of our community. And there seems to be confusion amongst particularly amongst your ministers, about what we're trying to intend to do in making people British citizenship. We have ministers shooting off saying we must have a test of Britishness. We have the more thoughtful work from Professor Crick in terms of how we indoctrinate people into being good citizens. What's your feeling about what makes a good citizen now?
I think the most important thing is that everybody who comes into this country shares the basic values of the country. Values about democracy, the rule of law, tolerance and respect for people of other faiths, and races and creeds. And I think that is the most important thing. I think that what binds us together and makes us British are the common values we have.
Would you say the English language is central to that?
Well, I think it goes back to what we were talking about integration before. I think it stands to reason that the more that people, whilst retaining their own identity in terms of religion or race, integrate, the better, and therefore that's why I think English language is important, yes.
Evidence given to my committee would suggest that there was a deficiency in terms of the ability of people to get English language. Peter Hyman, who used to work in your number 10 as an advisor, now works in an Islington school, said if only there was a capacity for intensive English language training when migrants come here, whether it's Pakistan or Poland,
yeah,
that would
I
make a
think
great
Prime Minister's
difference.
got it, yes. Quickly?
Yeah, no, I think
why not enough money for English language? Why not enough money and resources?
I think we do put a lot in. I mean, I haven't got the exact figures in front of me, but I think we do put a lot into it. But yes, there's more that we can do. But it's also, I think the thing that really worries me is if people have been here for maybe 10, 15, 20 years and can't speak the English language, because that is a worry.
Do you look at programmes in order to help those people?
Yes, and I think also then it goes back to what we were talking about earlier. You also need the community itself, where these people are living, to be engaged in that as well. Because that is.
On that note of cooperation, Mr. Williams?
Well, thank you very much, Gwyneth. We move now, Prime Minister, away from domestic affairs and into what, as I say, is likely to become a regular subject area, which is really across the international field, the international update. As to Georgia.
Prime Minister, in this last session we want to try and cover a lot of territory. We plan to ask short, focused questions, and I hope these will elicit short, focused answers. Can we start with Iraq and Michael Gapes?
Yes, Prime Minister, how long do you expect British troops to be in Iraq?
As long as the government there wishes them to be there, but I suspect we will over the next 18 months. There'll obviously be opportunities to draw down significant numbers of British troops because the capacity of the Iraqi forces will build up.
You've said 18 months. Have you had any discussions in government about the exact circumstances which would allow us to have a total withdrawal?
I mean, really what we've discussed in government is how, as progressively the Iraqi forces are more capable of taking over individual provinces, we can withdraw. I think when people talk about total withdrawal, I mean, I think you can get into debates about this. You know, if one's talking about substantial troop reductions, I think the Iraqi government, and we will only remain there as long as the Iraqi government wishes us to be there, I think they are keen to get control of their own security situation.
It's been suggested that actually the foreign forces in some parts of Iraq have become the focus for the insurrection and for the opposition, and that therefore our very presence is actually preventing the Iraqis themselves coming to a solution. Do you agree with that view?
Well, I agree that their presence is used by certain of the groups, but you know, it's a very interesting thing, Mike. When I was in Baghdad a short time ago, and I was actually asked by one of the leading Sunni people, you know, when are you and the Americans and the troops of the other countries going to withdraw? And I said, well, when do you want us to go? And the moment I put the question back to him, it very quickly became, well, not actually yet, thank you. So I think that, you know, the one thing I make a plea with, probably vainly, for the way the media report this, is not to disenfranchise the people the Iraqis have elected. I mean, they've got a coalition government, effectively, of all the main groups. So it's about as representative a government as you can possibly have. And they are the people who know the balance between us being a support and us being a provocation. And the one thing I think is very, very important in this is to listen to what they actually say. And what the Iraqis say is, and the Sunni who is the defense secretary said this in an article he wrote a short time ago, is yes, we want you to leave as soon as possible, but that possibility is not now. And I think that they are the best judges of this.
I've heard the same arguments, Prime Minister, both from Iraqis visiting this country and also when I've been in Iraq. I've been in Iraq 3 times. I was in Basra in January, and I have to say, each time I go there, it's my 3rd visit to Basra, the situation is worse in security terms than the first time that I went. Hasn't there come a point where we need to fundamentally reassess what we're doing in Basra and the south? Has the situation deteriorated because of our role there, or is there anything specifically we could be doing differently, given that it is a Shia-on-Shia struggle in the south rather than a Shia-Sunni conflict?
Well, what you've got is you've got the extremes on both sides. Sunni extremists up in the centre and the north, and down in the south, Shia extremists, and both of them have got the same aim: to prevent the democratic government having its writ run. Now, they may use, down in Basra, the presence of British forces as the excuse, but that's not really their aim. Their aim is to get political and security control of Basra so that they can run Basra rather than have the democratic government run it. And, you know, again, in Basra, and I've discussed this with the new Prime Minister, and I discussed it incidentally with Vice President Mehdi when he was here a short time ago. If they say to us, we're better off without you, we would go. But that's not what they're saying. They're saying, we need to build our own force capability here, but for the moment, we need you in support. Otherwise, these extremists who want to have a sectarian future for Iraq will succeed. So this is it's a very tough situation there. But as I say, the important thing is always to say, who are the people who are the authentic voice of Iraqis? And I think the best thing to do, and why shouldn't we say this as democratic politicians, is that the people they elect are the best. You know, they'll give you the best opinion as to what Iraqis really want.
Can I just remind you what you said last time we asked you about Iraq, which is November last year. You said there's not a great deal of good news about at the moment, but you went on to talk about a basic optimism for the future. Aren't we back where we were last November?
No,
Not a
we're
lot of good
not.
news at the moment, but basic optimism about the future.
Oh, well, in that sense, yes, I think there is, because of the democratic process. I mean, look, it's a perfectly simple thing. You've got a democratic process that, despite all the odds, has worked, where you've got the Sunnis voting, the Kurds voting, the Shia voting. They voted, actually, to come into a government together. They represent the majority of Iraqis, and you've got a small minority who want to disrupt the process and either return to Saddam type of policies or end up with sectarian Iraq.
Can I bring in Edward Lee now?
It's significant that you talk about politicians, conversations within the safety of the green zone. Let's talk about ordinary Iraqis. I mean, do you think that as far as ordinary people are concerned, not very interested in politics, the first thing they want from any government is personal security so they can get on with their own lives?
Of course.
Well,
absolutely.
Yeah, of course. You know, I've only been to Baghdad once years ago, before the invasion. I walked around without, there was no question of any threat to me personally or anybody else. And nobody in this room would dare walk around Baghdad. Now, do you accept the evidence, the Iraqi body count, that respected Oxford Research Institute, that 38,000 Iraqis, ordinary Iraqis, have died since your invasion?
Yeah, but hang on a minute, Edwin. You might have been able to walk around in Baghdad because you were a Westerner there. If you were someone who disagreed with Saddam's regime, you ended up in a mass grave.
Oh,
I mean,
come
that's-
on.
No,
Come
I'm
on.
sorry, you come on.
No,
300,000 people.
Prime Minister,
in
you
mass graves there.
are not surely suggesting to this committee that the ordinary life of Iraqis has in any conceivable way been improved, their personal security. These are not politicians, not the people you talk to. Do you accept that tens of thousands of Iraqis are now dead as a result of this invasion?
Well, hang on a minute. They're not dead as a result of the invasion or the removal of Saddam. They're dead as a result of the activities of a criminal minority who want to stop the majority getting the democracy they want. And as for these, politicians that you talk about in this way as if they didn't represent anybody, they stood for election. If the Iraqi people wanted to get Saddam back, they could have voted for a Saddam party. They didn't. And they didn't for a very simple reason, that like the rest of us, they prefer freedom. And there is no reason whatever why they shouldn't have it, except for the activities of this criminal minority. And our job should be, when these people are killing the innocent and butchering them with this appalling terrorism and atrocities, our job is to stand with the Democrats against the terrorists.
Yeah, but we surely...
You talk about it as if it's our fault that these people are dying.
I'm sorry, the invasion has taken place. There was a great deal of debate. There was ample warning given to you from many sources that the invasion would exacerbate sectarian tensions. We are where we are. You have a country which is on the brink of civil war. Every time you come to this liaison committee, you say it's getting better. You heard what Mike Gape said, his experience in Basra. I was talking to a constituent recently. He was sick with worry about her soldier son in Basra, saying that our troops were not wanted there. I mean, when was the last time you talked to a private soldier without their officers listening in? When was the last time you talked to ordinary Iraqis?
Actually, excuse me, Edward, I talk to soldiers, certainly, a lot of the time, and actually the soldiers themselves who are out there have a very clear view of the validity of what they're doing. And it's true I don't get to talk to many ordinary Iraqis, but I tell you what I did do just last Wednesday. I met 8 Iraqi members of parliament from different parts of Iraq. And that's what I mean by disenfranchising these people. They're elected. I mean, shouldn't we listen to them? They're not saying, we wish you'd never got rid of Saddam, we were better off with Saddam. What they're saying is, help us to sort this security situation. And my view of this is, because I think it is part of the total global picture, when these people want to disrupt the desire of the majority to get a democracy, and they do desire it because that's what they voted for. They participated in this election despite being harried and hounded and subject to acts of terrorism. When they elect their government, why on earth shouldn't we be standing alongside them trying to help them get the democracy they want, instead of saying to them, I'm sorry, you've got a choice. You can either have a brutal dictator who used to murder you if you disagreed with them, or alternative, you can have sectarians who murder you if you disagree with them. Why shouldn't they have the same rights as everybody else? And why shouldn't our job as the international community, and after all we're there with a UN mandate now and have been for 3 years, to be behind them? And I think I really regret when people say these things that as if the troops out there aren't doing a valuable job. The people who can determine whether they're doing a valuable job or not are not just ourselves, but actually the Iraqi politicians who are elected out there, and they want them to stay and help them.
Prime Minister, can we move on to Afghanistan, an equally, if not more worrying situation? Malcolm Bruce.
Prime Minister, I'm sure you and the whole committee will have sympathy with the families of the 5 British soldiers who have been killed in Helmand province in the last 3 weeks. We currently have 3,300 troops, rising to a peak of somewhat less than 5,700. Is that enough troops to do the job in that particularly dangerous province?
Well, first of all, I would both repeat the condolences I gave in an earlier stage for the soldiers killed, and also the soldiers just recently killed a couple of days ago, who are very, very brave people and doing an absolutely extraordinary and important job out there. And insofar as the issue to do with the levels of troops or their equipment, obviously any requests that are made by the military, we would respond to positively.
Well, at the moment, we've had 5 casualties in 3 weeks. This is a 3-year mission, at least a 3-year mission. There are reported at the weekend 8 enemy contacts a day. Have we, and I say by we, Parliament, maybe you, the British people, been misled about the scale and the risks of the mission to which our troops are committed?
I looked very carefully at the statement John Reid made to the House of Commons, I think on the 26th of January, and also the full statement that he made when he was in Kabul in April. There's never been any doubt that when you move down into the south, into the Helmand province, it was going to be a lot more dangerous. It is going to be a lot more dangerous. And it's an enormous tribute to our troops that they're doing this work there. But we should support them in the work that they're doing. The work they're doing is absolutely vital, because if the Taliban get a foothold back in Afghanistan, then the very reasons following September the 11th why we had to go into Afghanistan will all reappear, with all the consequences for our own security and the security of the wider world.
I don't dissent from that. I don't think there's disagreement about that objective. I think the concern, nevertheless, is that our troops have been put into a situation where they may be overexposed, and also that there's some degree of inconsistency or incompatibility with security and assisting development. And can I just ask you this question, Prime Minister? We have a situation where in Helmand province, poppy cultivation has gone up to 45,000 hectares and a value of over $200 million expected this year. And part of our troops' mission is effectively to deprive the farmers who are growing those poppies of their livelihoods. How is that going to win the hearts and minds of the people? And how is that going to secure the province and indeed not expose our own soldiers to even greater risks?
Look, the whole purpose of the mission down in Helmand, and we are in Afghanistan, so are the troops of many, many other countries. And down in the south, we operate with thousands of troops from other countries as well. The whole purpose of the mission is to support the reconstruction in Afghanistan, and precisely to make sure that in the Helmand province, where much of the problems have arisen, many of the problems have arisen, to make sure that we are able to establish proper government there and give a livelihood to the local population that does not involve them producing heroin.
That's the problem, Prime Minister. It is estimated that 55,000 households, 380,000 people, 1/3 of the entire population of the province, are dependent on the poppy crop, which yields about 12 times in value what wheat does. If our troops are engaged on effectively taking that livelihood away, isn't the consequence of that likely to be disaffection, recruitment into the Taliban, and a greater threat to the security of our own troops?
What do you suggest the alternative is? To let the province carry on growing large amounts of the poppy crop, with all that means for not just for us and the heroin that comes onto our streets, since for many, many years, as you know, 90% of the heroin in the UK comes from Afghanistan, but also for Afghanistan itself being turned into a narco-economy. Look, the purpose of what we're doing down there, there's frankly, a lot of nonsense taught about the mission being uncertain or people not knowing what the mission is. As John explained when he came to the House on the 26th of January, the mission is to assist the Afghan government in the process of reconstruction, which includes making sure that instead of being dependent on the drug trade, their economy can grow and prosper properly and normally. As he said then, and as we know now, in order to do that, we will have to defend ourselves when attacked and take preemptive action if necessary. That's precisely why we said at the time this is a more dangerous mission, as have been the other missions which have been round in Afghanistan, where you're actually directly taking on people who are trying to prevent that reconstruction taking place.
Can I just finally say to you, Prime Minister, in Thailand, where they had a drug problem, they did in fact take a phased programme over several years of actually paying people the equivalent amount. If you take the livelihoods away from people and cannot find an alternative, is the reality, that's my point, not that you're actually not getting the support of the people because you're making them poorer when you're supposed to be helping them get out of poverty.
Right, Malcolm, the whole point about the programme is that we're not simply taking their livelihoods away and saying that's it. Britain itself alone is putting in over the next few years somewhere in the region of $250 million into programmes of alternative livelihood. And this is being done in conjunction with the Afghan government. The reason why the Afghan government are so insistent that they work particularly on Helmand province is exactly for the reason that you've given. That's where the Taliban want to get a foothold back in there. It's also obviously what Al-Qaeda want as well. And of course, these people use the narcotics and the drug trade in order to do that. But my point again is, the most important thing for us as an international community is to stand with the Afghan government and help them make sure that the Taliban can't come back in, because Afghanistan has made real progress in the past few years. I mean, if you take the girls that are able to go back into school, the people of the return to Afghanistan, even the growth of the economy, there are changes that are happening. But again, you've got the same global movement trying to prevent these countries becoming stable countries, becoming democracies, which their people want. And the reason for that is very simple, that if they become those types of stable democracies, the Taliban are gone. And so are Al-Qaeda with them.
Alan, can we just follow on that? The other day, there were two incidents on the same day, one in which our troops were surrounded on three sides. They escaped without loss. But the dangerous lesson that was learned, if the reports are correct, by the Taliban, was that the reason the helicopters couldn't help them in that battle was because the helicopters were already engaged in another battle. Now, if we're that limited in resources, the Taliban will still soon work out tactics to adapt to it.
Yeah, and let me just say, thank you for raising that, because it allows me to make one thing absolutely clear. I mean, I was reading all sorts of reports in the newspapers that the generals had demanded this and demanded that of me last week and so on. I haven't actually received any request yet. But, of course, whenever you do a mission like this, you're constantly, and so are they, the commanders on the ground, quite rightly assessing what more do we need in terms maybe of personnel or equipment or resource. Anything they need and ask for in order to protect our troops, I will make sure that they get. That is our obligation to them, is to give them what they need to do the job. And if they come to us and say, which they haven't so far, but they may well do, this is what we require in addition, because now we're actually there, we can see this problem and that problem emerging, of course we will respond to it positively. The important thing to realise, though, is that we always knew this mission was going to be difficult. We said that right from the outset, and it's going to be difficult precisely because of its importance in turning the country round. And what is happening is that, first of all, in the north, and then in the west of the country, and then in the south, we have been going bit by bit through this, and Britain hasn't been doing all of it. There have been many other countries involved as well in trying to make sure that we support the local Afghan government in making sure that they can deal with these problems of reconstruction and the problems that they have with the Taliban trying to get a foothold back.
Can we pursue the theme that Malcolm mentioned at the end, the war on the opium trade, and bring in Phyllis Starkey and the relationships with Iran?
Much of the drugs from Afghanistan transit through Iran, and there's very productive cooperation at the moment between the UK and the Iranian authorities on trying to control that trade. And when I was in Iran just a few weeks ago, they were pointed out the large numbers of Iranian border guards who have paid with their lives in trying to combat this trade, enormously to the benefit of people in this country and the rest of Europe. Have you taken into account the damage that might be caused to that cooperation, and therefore our ability to reduce opium flows to the UK if the nuclear issue leads to a confrontation with Iran?
We would prefer good relations with Iran. in part for the reasons you give, and also because of our concerns about Iranian influence in the south of Iraq, for example. But I don't think our desire for that good relationship can displace what is, I think, a legitimate concern about Iranian nuclear ambitions. Now, they have an offer on the table now from the United States. It's what they've always wanted. They've always wanted the US to be part of the negotiation. We can have a proper negotiation with the Iranians, but they should come into line with their international obligations on the suspension of enrichment.
Can I bring Andrew in on that specific point?
Prime Minister, you told us in February of the increased transatlantic cooperation on Iran. With hindsight, isn't it a shame that there was such a delay in getting an understanding between the US and Europe to create a concerted position? Wouldn't it have been much more helpful if we'd have engaged with Iran about the nuclear issue a lot earlier?
Well, we've tried to do this, Andrew. I mean, the E3, that's Britain, France and Germany, have been working on this very closely with America effectively giving its backing. And then my very strong view was that we had to take that further and actually say that America was prepared to join these negotiations. But so far we've not had a lot of comeback from Iran of a very helpful nature.
That I understand, but domestically in Iran, the president is building a sort of nationalistic fervour around this, pointing out, as Phyllis has, that on the one hand the West wants our cooperation on the drugs issue, and on the other doesn't want us to have our own domestic nuclear power policy. Haven't we got ourselves into a position where it's going to be extremely difficult for the Iranian authorities to come to an agreement without it being perceived domestically as them backing down?
Well, we have tried to give them every, for them, the Americans joining this negotiation is a huge thing. So if they wanted to use that in order to say, by suspending enrichment, we have now brought the Americans to the negotiation, they could do it. I mean, it's not impossible for them to do that. Now, I know there's a meeting that is to take place, I think, maybe tomorrow, with Mr. Larijani and the Europeans. I mean, I hope they take this opportunity, but because I agree with Phyllis. I mean, it is important that we cooperate with them. But this is part of a bigger issue, I'm afraid.
But another interpretation, of course, could be that they've just been spinning us along whilst they perfect the enrichment technology.
Well, that's what some people think. Now, I'm prepared to go to every outer limit in order to give them the chance to disprove that.
So how long have they got before they reply to this new package that you mentioned a moment ago?
Well, we've not set a deadline on it, but I mean, how much... There's not a great deal of detail that needs to be discussed in a sense. It really means... You see, it's a question of whether they're prepared to enter into a framework that allows them to develop civil nuclear power. Because that is fair enough for them to do that. But the safeguards that the international community seek to prevent that becoming a nuclear weapons program have got to be adhered to. Now, I think they know what the situation is fairly clearly. And my worry is that they will make the mistake of thinking they can divide the international community when actually I don't think in the end that will happen on this issue.
So you want to press for an early response?
I'd like a response as soon as possible, because I don't really see what more there is to talk about.
End of the month?
Well, I mean, as I say, I don't set a deadline, but it would be interesting if there was an indication given at tomorrow's meeting, for example, of where the Iranians really stood on this question.
Can we move on to Guantanamo? Mohammed Sawa.
Prime Minister, an FBI memo on Guantanamo Bay reported in the New York Times recently described incidents of abuse involving strangulation, beatings, and the placing of lit cigarettes into detainees' ears. 3 detainees, out of despair, has committed suicide last month. In a report last year, Amnesty International called the camp the gulag of our times and for it to be shut down. Our own Attorney General has called for Guantanamo Bay to be shut down. What is your response, and what are you doing to ensure Guantanamo Bay shut down? Probably this can give you the opportunity to disagree with the American administration loud and clear, and probably produce some positive headlines for British public.
Thank you for that kind offer. Look, I've always made it clear that I think Guantanamo should close. I mean, the trouble is the Americans are going to have to work out what they do with the particular individuals there, and that's obviously been complicated by the Supreme Court ruling. But I just hope people do, though, look back and remember how all this arose. I think one of the most, I mean, I found it, if you'll forgive me just for a moment, going back to Afghanistan, one of the most difficult things is people forgetting September the 11th and why we're all talking about these issues today. You know, we tend to forget about it. However, having said that, quite apart from anything else, I don't think it's sensible for the US to continue this for a moment longer than it need.
Prime Minister, you've described Guantanamo as an anomaly. The Attorney General has said it was unacceptable. Do you agree with him?
Well, obviously I agree with what I said myself. As for what the Attorney said, well, I've just said now. And in fact, I've always said, I think it's better that it closed. But there is a problem. You know, this did arise out of the worst terrorist act the world has ever known, and 3,000 people dying on the streets of New York.
Yeah. On a related theme, can we move on to US-UK relationships? Sir Patrick Cormack.
It's reassuring to know you agree with yourself.
It's not always the case, actually, but anyway.
Well, we can't go into that at the moment,
No.
but it is July the 4th, and perhaps we could look at United States relations with this country. You have forged a particularly close relationship with President Bush. As one of those who gave you strong support over Iraq, and I don't in any way regret that, I do feel that many things have gone perhaps not as you or I would have wished them. At your joint press conference on the 26th of May, the President was really very apologetic over a number of areas. Do you endorse that line?
Well, I think he was saying, which is his absolute right to say, that he regretted using certain phrases. I don't think he was meaning to regret the decisions that have been taken.
No, I'm not suggesting he was.
You know, but I think, look, I have a different, obviously I have a different view from the view that many people take. I think September the 11th was an attack upon the whole Western world. I think our right place was shoulder to shoulder with America since then. I've never changed my view. It was my view then, it's my view now. And I think everything we have been discussing today around a whole series of related issues comes back to a fundamental question, which is whether the West is prepared to stand up for its values that actually are not values to do with one religion or one race, but are universal values.
Prime Minister, I hope that view will be widely echoed, but because of your very strong support for the United States, you were given a singular honour. You were given the Congressional Medal of Honour, no less, one of very, very few non-United States citizens to have this great honour. You graciously accepted it, but you've never been to collect it. Why?
Well, I'm always mystified when I'm asked about this. I mean, I do feel a deep sense of honour that I've been awarded a congressional medal. I've just, I will go around, absolutely, but as I understand it, there's a sort of ceremony that has to be gone through, and I'm not, I've got other pressing things to do, frankly.
I'm sure they can lay it on next time you go over.
Well, I'm sure they can, and I don't quite know what people think, whether they think I'm not accepting it because I'm embarrassed to accept it. I'm very honoured to have it. Well, it's nonsense. I mean, it's not as if my support of America or my belief in the transatlantic alliance is a sort of well-kept secret. I mean, I am absolutely... Look, my view of this country in the early 21st century is you've got two big relationships. One's with Europe, the other's with America. Keep both of them really strong.
Well, yes, we're very pleased you've got to have gone.
But the Congressional Medal to me is not...
No, but it's symbolic, Prime Minister. So
Okay,
perhaps you'll give this liaison committee a promise that next time you go over, you'll happily receive it.
Well, I don't know that I will give you that assurance because it depends what else I'm doing. But none of that should be taken as anything other than simply that I've got a busy agenda. It's not that I'm in the least anything other than completely honoured to have it.
You're not normally bashful. It won't take very long. So we will.
Well, I don't know that I'm not normally bashful.
With great interest. July the 4th is the time to say you'll take it off.
Yeah, but it's,
Prime Minister.
No doubt I will at some point, but when that is, I don't. Huh?
It's Prime Minister,
really, it's got absolutely nothing to do with that at all. It is to do with the fact that you do, if you're going to set time aside to do that. I mean, the last time I was in the States, I was in and out pretty quickly, and I had a big lecture to give at Georgetown University. And frankly, there are lots of other things to do.
But Prime Minister, on the point that Sir Patrick raised about our relationship with the US, you've always made it clear that you've supported US policy not because you want anything in return, but because you felt it was right.
Correct.
Nonetheless, on a number of key issues, the ITAR waiver, US, UK, American airline services, on the imposition of steel tariffs the day our Marines went into Afghanistan, you must have been disappointed at the response from the United States to representations from yourself. Have you got as much out of the relationship as you had expected or hoped for?
Yeah, but I mean, first of all, there are trade issues that have gone on for ever and a day between the US and America, and that will continue. But I think it is very worrying. We were talking about opinion polls earlier. I think some of the polls to do with this country's support for America are worrying to me, and attitudes to America. And I think we should, just realize that this relationship is one that we should be very proud of and very committed to. And if people just think of the substitutes for the American relationship for a moment, I can't see any. And I'd be grateful to hear any suggestions of what they are. And therefore I can go and give you a list of things that I think we've managed to achieve certain changes in policy as a result of what happens with America or not, but that's not the point. As you rightly say, it shouldn't be done on the basis of what you get back. It should be done on the basis of what's right.
Okay. Can we have a quick question on Israel-Palestine from Mike Gapes?
So the situation in Gaza is extremely serious. Can you update us on, firstly, what our government is doing to try to deal with the situation, but also when the Israelis withdrew unilaterally last year, many people, and you were amongst them, said, well, at least this is a step in the right direction. But doesn't the current situation in Gaza show the limitations of unilateralism on all sides?
Yeah, I mean, look, you're completely right. I mean, first of all, what we are doing is, along with other allies, just trying to calm the situation, get the particular soldier released, obviously, and then to make sure that what is happening to the Palestinians is also that there's a drawback on both sides, because what is happening is ghastly and terrible. And the one thing I would say, and this is in this one respect, I think there is a real issue to do with the West and the Muslim world. I think there is no more important issue to sort out than this. And if we do not do our best as an international community to sort it out, and I don't think we're doing enough at the moment, then we will pay, in fact, I think we do pay a very heavy price in terms of our relations with the Arab and Muslim world. Now, none of that means to say I'm anything other than a committed supporter of the existence of the State of Israel, because I am. But I think that this will not be resolved, in my view, unless from the outside, the international community, and in particular the US, grip the situation. This cannot be resolved simply by the two sides.
Could we have a quick supplementary from Mohammed?
Prime Minister, the Israeli airstrikes against infrastructure in Gaza, including the bombing of the territory's only power station and demolition of bridges, has led to the Palestinian people being deprived of power and water supply. This collective punishment has caused immense suffering to innocent men, women, and children. Do you agree that this is the worst example of might is right and lost jungle?
Well, I agree with this, that unless we manage to get the situation into a different position, then the Israelis are going to continue to take punitive action, and the Palestinians are going to continue to have a burning sense of injustice. Now, I've learned enough about this situation over the years to realize that going in and condemning either side is not deeply helpful. But one plea I would make in this area, we were talking earlier about Northern Ireland. In respect to Northern Ireland, the basic problem, which is why it has been a difficult negotiation, is that there is no agreement about the final negotiation. One part wants to be with the United Ireland, the other part wants to be with the United Kingdom. What frustrates me more than anything else about the Israeli-Palestinian situation is there is agreement about the final outcome. And that's why I say the international community has just got, it's got to focus on this with a completely different order of magnitude. Because there is no reason why the Palestinians shouldn't have their state. They're an incredibly industrious, hard-working people, actually. The diaspora of Palestinians around the world is testimony to that. And of course Israel has to protect its security. And it is, I think, a situation where I really fear if we do not grip it as an international community, then it is going to disintegrate. And it's going to disintegrate in circumstances where, in fact, there is agreement about the ultimate negotiation.
Prime Minister, can I ask you a last question before I bring in John McFall for a final one? Over the last 9 sessions, we've asked you intensively about foreign policy. Much of it has been very controversial. It's precipitated cabinet resignation. Some of it has split your party. And it's a foreign policy with a very strong personal imprint. What assurance can anyone have that it might survive a leadership change?
Well, it depends on the person who takes the decisions. But I think, I mean, I may be wrong in this, but I think that the basic position of this country, and in particular its alliance with America, is something that any person who does the job will feel very strongly and very keenly. So I personally believe we will continue. In fact, if you can think of any of the potential successors, I'm sure that will be the case.
John McFall.
Just to maintain that theme, Prime Minister, in terms of relations with US and Europe, the Treasury Committee presently is undertaking an inquiry into globalisation, and we have visited both China and India. And I think one of the main impressions that's been given to us is that the sheer scale, scope and the spread of the changes is enormous. And whilst the rise of China and India is positive for the world economy as a whole, the benefits will be unevenly spread. We've seen the drift of manufacturing jobs in 2005, over 1 million to China from Europe, America and Japan. And the competitive strength of China in manufacturing, I think, is unbeatable on that. Now, the way we react in Europe and America will be the most important determinant of the future shape of both the US and the European economy. Some would say, though, that we're on the brink of a very distressing period, both economically and environmentally, and indeed socially. So if we are to avoid the rise of protectionism, which we have seen in both the US and in Europe, and avoid negative international and foreign policy relations, what do we do about it?
Well,
this is a primer for the next one.
In a nutshell, what we do is realise that whatever differences there are between America and Europe from time to time, what joins them together is infinitely more important. And whether it's on the world economy or on how we deal with extremism or how we defend values of democracy and tolerance, in the end, America and Europe, in my view, should stick and stand together. And if we do that, particularly with the rise of China, that I believe incidentally is a benign development, don't misunderstand me, but I think it is particularly important given the big change that will happen in geopolitics in the next few years, which is about the rise of China, and then you've got India as well, of course, and other countries too, and Russia. It's just axiomatic to me that the Americans and the Europeans stick together. That's why I think this transatlantic alliance is so important, and that's why I'm absolutely sure, really, that it will always be of importance to this country. And the reason why foreign policy has dominated so much of our discussion is that in today's world, it's another consequence of globalization. It is going to dominate policy, and domestic and foreign policy, the distinction between the two, in my view, has never been more blurred than it is today.
Prime Minister, you initiated these series of meetings, and we found them very valuable, whatever anyone else may think. Would you, well, the press are always cynical about what we do as parliamentarians. Would you recommend to a successor, since this is the first time a Prime Minister has been accountable to a committee of this House, would you recommend to a successor that he should continue with these hearings in the light of your own experience?
I think you know, for my success, you can make them weekly.
I think in that case,
very valuable.
Long may you continue. Thank you, Prime Minister.
Right.
Order.
Portcullis House, Line 1, the Boothroyd Room. Portcullis House, Line 1, the Boothroyd Room. Portcullis House, Line 1, the Booth...